She had learned, over 7 years of marriage, that silence was the only armor a duchess could afford. Not the silence of the defeated, not the silence of the broken. The particular, deliberate silence of a woman who had long since stopped expecting mercy from the man who owned her name. Evelyn Ashcombe Ravenshade knew what the banquet tonight was really for. She had known since the morning, when the kitchen maid stopped whispering the moment she entered the room, when the head steward could not hold her gaze, when the flower arrangements arrived in white and gold, Lillian's colors, not the house colors of Ravenshade, and no one said a word. She dressed anyway. She chose the deep burgundy gown. She held her own hand in the mirror, and she walked downstairs to be destroyed. The great dining hall of Ravenshade Manor had been built to intimidate. That was the honest truth of it, stripped of all the language nobles used to dress their cruelties in beauty. The ceilings vaulted 40 feet overhead, ribbed in black oak and hammered silver, designed so that sound moved strangely. Whispers carried to the wrong ears, laughter echoed longer than it should, and the silence between heartbeats felt like a held sentence waiting to fall. 3 tiered chandeliers hung above the table, each one a constellation of candles that drowned the room in amber light so warm it looked from the outside like joy. Evelyn had always thought it looked like a beautiful trap. She stood at the entrance to the hall for exactly 4 seconds before anyone noticed her. She used those seconds the way she had learned to use every quiet interval, counting, cataloging, reading the room the way a chess player reads a board 3 moves before the crisis arrives. 41 guests. The long table dressed for a celebration rather than a formal dinner, which meant the hierarchy of seating had been deliberately, pointedly rearranged. The Ashford cousins to the left flank, which was wrong. Lord Pembroke and his wife seated at the inner curve, which was wrong. And at the far end of the table, in the seat that had belonged to the Lady of Ravenshade for 6 generations of Ashcombe women, a girl in white and gold, Lillian. She was 22, maybe 23, dark hair pinned with pearl clips that Evelyn recognized immediately. They had belonged to Cedric's mother, locked in a glass case in the East Wing, which meant Cedric had given them to her, which meant Cedric had made a decision about what kind of statement tonight would be. The girl was not ugly. Evelyn had no interest in pretending she was. She had the kind of brightness that came from youth untouched by real consequence, that soft, unguarded quality in the eyes that said the world had not yet handed her a bill for anything. She was laughing at something the man beside her had said. She touched her own throat when she laughed. Her dress cost more than the quarterly wages of every maid in the house combined. Evelyn took one breath. Then she walked forward. The room shifted the moment she moved, that particular awful stillness that travels through a gathering like a current, heads turning, conversations dropping in pitch, glasses pausing halfway to mouths. She had grown up understanding that stillness. It was the sound of a crowd deciding whether to pity someone or watch them be humiliated, often both. The decision came fast and was rarely kind. She found Cedric near the fireplace, as she had known she would. He always positioned himself near fire, near heat, near the thing most likely to draw eyes. It was one of his oldest vanities, one of the first things she had cataloged about him back when cataloging his patterns felt like intimacy rather than survival. He was speaking with Lord Hargrove, one hand resting on the mantelpiece in that particular studied ease that meant he was performing rather than relaxing. He wore charcoal gray and the Ravenshade crestpin at his collar. His jaw was sharp. His posture was the posture of a man who had never once in his life been asked to leave a room. He saw her. Something moved across his face. Not guilt. She had stopped expecting guilt around the 3rd year, but something more complex and, she thought, more honest about what he had become. A kind of impatience. A faint, thin contempt. The expression of a man who had already finished a conversation in his head and was annoyed to find the other party still in the room. Evelyn. He said her name the way you say a piece of furniture's name when it is in an inconvenient location. You're here. It is my home, she said. The words came out clean and level. She was proud of that. In the private way, she took pride in small, unwitnessed victories. Lord Hargrove looked at the floor. Cedric's jaw moved once, a flex of muscle that meant he had registered a retort and filed it away for later, when there were fewer witnesses or more convenient ones. Hargrove, Cedric said, without looking away from her. Give us a moment. The older man relocated himself with the efficiency of someone who had been waiting for permission to escape. Evelyn watched him go. Then she looked back at her husband. You seated her at the head of the table, she said. I seated the dinner guests where it made sense. At my table, in my chair. My chair, Cedric said, and the correction was so casual, so automatic, that she understood he had not even thought about it. That was almost worse than if he had. A deliberate wound implies the other person still has the power to wound back. This was simply correction, the kind you offer to someone who has misidentified a piece of property. My house, my table, my dinner. I invited you as a courtesy. Something moved through her chest. She had no name for it anymore. In the early years, she had called it grief. In the middle years, she had called it fury. Now it was just a pressure, a structural weight, like a stone placed on a rib cage, one careful ounce at a time, until breathing became a deliberate act. A courtesy, she repeated. Don't make it a scene, Evelyn. Sit where you've been placed and behave like the woman I married you to be. He reached out and straightened his cuff. It was a gesture so minor it shouldn't have registered. It registered. This is a dinner, not a trial. She sat where she was placed. She had been placed in the third seat from the left, below the salt line, between the Ashford cousins who could barely look at her and a younger baron whose name she always forgot. The seat was not technically an insult in the old court hierarchy. She had been in the room long enough to know that. But it was an insult in every way that mattered inside a living, breathing marriage. She was seated the way you seat an acquaintance. A neighbor's wife. A woman whose presence is tolerated rather than centered. From the third seat from the left, she had a direct sight line to the head of the table. She did not look away. She made herself watch because she had decided somewhere in the last 6 months that looking away was a form of surrender she was no longer willing to afford herself. If she was going to be made to understand the exact dimensions of her own diminishment, she was going to understand them completely, clearly, with open eyes. Lillian sat at the head of Evelyn's table and laughed, and touched the pearls at her throat, and did not once look in Evelyn's direction. Not from cruelty, Evelyn thought, from something more unconsciously devastating. She simply did not think about Evelyn at all. The wife was furniture. The wife was a weather condition. The wife was a fact of the landscape that did not require acknowledgement. The dinner was served in 7 courses. Evelyn ate 4 of them. The conversation around her had the careful, overly animated quality of a gathering where everyone has agreed, without discussion, to collectively pretend that the most obvious thing in the room is not happening. She had been to enough of these dinners to recognize the performance. Nobles were extraordinarily gifted at it, perhaps the most under-acknowledged talent of the aristocracy. This ability to sustain elaborate collective fiction in the face of open, undeniable reality. Lord Pembroke discussed the northern grain prices with aggressive specificity. Lady Wyndham delivered a lengthy opinion on a recent theatrical production in the capital. The Ashford cousins discussed horses. Evelyn watched her husband. She watched the way he touched Lillian's hand when he refilled her wine, the way he leaned close to her ear and made her laugh at something private, something that existed only between them, a small sealed world to which Evelyn had never been issued a key. She watched the girl tilt her head toward him, that instinctive female lean toward warmth and attention, and she thought, she genuinely believes she is safe. It was the saddest part, in a way that had nothing to do with jealousy. She watched Lillian look at Cedric with that particular luminous trust and thought, with a clarity that surprised her. He will do this to her too. He does not know how to stop. The 7th course had just been cleared when Cedric stood. The room quieted. He had that quality, physical authority, the kind that derived from a lifetime of rooms quieting when he stood. His voice was unhurried and warm and carried the complete confidence of a man who has never once considered that a room might not want to hear from him. I want to take a moment, he said, to acknowledge someone who has brought considerable light into this house over the past year. Evelyn's hand rested on the table. She did not move it. Lillian has become, and I think everyone in this room who has had the pleasure of knowing her will agree, an indispensable part of the life of this estate. Her warmth, her spirit, the particular grace she brings to every room she enters. He raised his glass. His eyes were on the girl at the head of the table, who had gone pink in the cheeks, who was shaking her head in sweet performative protest. To Lillian. 41 voices said, to Lillian. Evelyn did not raise her glass. Her hand did not move. She sat and breathed and looked at a point on the tablecloth 2 inches from her plate, and understood, with the final, settling certainty of a woman watching the last door close, that this was not an accident. None of this was an accident. The seating, the toast, The public declaration in a room full of witnesses. This was architecture. Cedric had built this evening the way you build a case. He was establishing a record. He was telling everyone in this room, in the most public language available, how things stood. She was being erased. Not quickly, not violently, not in a way that would give her the dignity of a dramatic exit. She was being erased the way you erase pencil, slowly, with pressure applied in the same spot, again and again, until the mark becomes lighter and lighter, and then simply is not there anymore. The applause that followed the toast was brief and uncertain, the sound of people who are uncomfortable but unwilling to be the one who did not clap. Then Cedric looked directly at her. Evelyn. The warmth in his voice was the worst thing. It was the warmth of a man who has already decided the outcome and is simply administering it. Lillian's cup is empty. Would you mind? The silence that followed was not the silence of 41 people failing to hear. It was the silence of 41 people holding their breath. Evelyn looked at her husband's face and saw nothing there. No guilt, no hesitation, no flicker of the man she had agreed to spend her life with in a church 14 years ago in front of their combined families. Just that patient, open expectation. The expression of someone who expects compliance because compliance has always come. She looked at Lillian. The girl's eyes were wide and fixed somewhere to the left of Evelyn's shoulder, in the particular avoidance of someone who desperately wants not to be responsible for what is happening. She looked at the teapot on the serving table behind her. She thought about the word survival, not in an abstract way, in the specific clinical way you think about a mechanism when you are trying to understand how it works. What survival required in this moment, in this room, in this life that had been assembled around her like a cage so slowly, she had not noticed the bars going up until she was fully inside. It required stillness. It required the calculation that one act of public defiance, here, tonight, without resources, without allies, without a single person in this room powerful enough to absorb the consequence of standing beside her, one act of defiance would accomplish nothing except to give Cedric the scene he had perhaps been hoping for. A duchess who threw teapots was a duchess easily dismissed. A mad wife was a useful wife. Survival right now required the most devastating thing she had ever done. She stood. She walked to the serving table. She lifted the teapot. She walked the length of the room, past 39 pairs of eyes that would not meet hers, past the fire that Cedric always stood near, past the chair that had been her mother's chair, and she knelt beside Lillian's seat. She poured the tea. Her hands were perfectly steady. She had always been proud of her hands. The room was so quiet she could hear the sound of the liquid moving from the pot to the cup. A small, domestic sound. The sound of an ordinary afternoon. The most humiliating sound she had ever heard in her life. Lillian did not say thank you. The girl stared at her lap. Cedric watched with an expression that she was able to read from her peripheral vision with horrible clarity. It was not triumph exactly, though there was triumph in it. It was something more satisfied and more final. The expression of a man checking an item off a mental list. She will do it. The confirmation of a theory he had been running for years. She rose. She returned to her seat. She sat down. She placed her hands in her lap where no one could see them, and she pressed her fingertips into her palms hard enough to leave marks. And she thought, I am still here. I am still inside this body. I am still the person who walked into this room. It was not comfort exactly. It was accounting, taking inventory of what remained. The dinner concluded an hour later. Guests made their departures with the brisk, purposeful efficiency of people escaping a burning building while pretending there is no fire. She stood in the entrance hall and received their farewells with the composure of a woman who has had years of practice performing composure. Lady Wyndham pressed her hand and held it a beat too long and said nothing, which was its own form of communication. Lord Hargrove did not look at her. The Ashford cousins had apparently decided that speed was a form of mercy. Cedric saw the last guests out. Then he turned back to the entrance hall, rolling one sleeve to his elbow, and looked at her with the mild disinterest of a man who has finished a day's work. That went well, he said. Evelyn stood at the foot of the staircase. The chandelier above her was still lit, and its light made the white marble of the steps look cold, the kind of cold that has texture that you can feel through the soles of your shoes. I want to understand something, she said. He stopped rolling his sleeve and looked at her with the expression that meant he had already pre-decided this conversation. Evelyn, I want to understand what you think happens next. She kept her voice level. Not quiet. Level was different. Level had architecture in it. You believe the next step is what exactly? You replace me? You install her at that table permanently? You think the court accepts that? I think, Cedric said, and there was something coming into his voice now, an edge that lived there when he had run out of patience for the performance of consideration, that the court accepts what I tell it to accept. I think that is how this has always worked, and I think you know it, and I think this conversation is going to end the same way the last four have ended, with you saying something very dignified and me going to bed. So, he gestured at the staircase behind her. Let's skip to the end. Is this about the Aldermore contract? She watched his face. Because if this is your way of, this is not about a contract. The edge sharpened. This is about the fact that I have spent 7 years waiting for you to become something worth the effort, and you have remained, consistently and without improvement, exactly what you were when I made the mistake of agreeing to this arrangement. He said it the way you say a clinical observation. Not with cruelty exactly, but with a worse thing, absolute bored certainty. You are a passable hostess and a competent manager of the household accounts, and a complete and total failure at everything else a wife is supposed to provide. Everything else being, don't. No, tell me. She could feel her own pulse in her fingertips. She kept her voice level. I want to hear you say it. Warmth, he said. Joy. The particular ability to make a man feel that his home is his home and not a very expensive prison he has to return to every evening. Lillian walks into a room and people feel lighter. You walk into a room and everyone holds their breath waiting for you to disapprove of something. He paused. You have disapproving down to an art form, Evelyn. I'll give you that. The silence between them had weight. She had learned to measure the weight of silences with him. This one was approximately 7 years heavy, give or take the months before she had understood what she had married. She is 22 years old, Evelyn said. Yes. She is a maid you promoted to. She is someone who makes me feel something. The boredom in his voice dropped away, and for a moment, just a moment, she saw something real underneath it. Not love, not precisely, but a genuine hunger, the kind that comes from years of emotional starvation and latches onto the first available warmth without caring about the architecture it burns through to get there. And I am 38 years old, and I have exactly one life, and I intend to stop spending it performing a marriage for the benefit of people who go home to families they actually want. He turned and walked toward the east wing. Cedric. She said his name not loudly, but in a way that stopped him. He turned. If you move her into this house, formally, permanently, publicly, you will be making a statement to the court that cannot be undone. You understand that? I understand it completely, he said. That's rather the point. He went. She stood at the foot of the stairs for a very long time. The chandelier above her guttered slightly. A draft from somewhere, the old manor breathing. One by one, the candles in the dining hall behind her were put out by the night staff, and the amber warmth that had made the trap look like joy was extinguished piece by piece until the only light remaining was the cold white of the entrance hall and the sound of her own measured breathing. She was a duchess with no court support. She was the daughter of a minor house in the east that had spent its political capital on the Ravenshade marriage alliance and had nothing left to offer as collateral. She had no siblings with rank, no living parents, no patron among the noble families who owed her a favor that outweighed Cedric's ability to call it in. She had, when she audited the inventory of her actual resources with the clinical honesty that survival required, exactly two things: the formal title that Cedric had not yet legally stripped from her, and the knowledge, private, burning, humiliating, that she was completely, utterly alone in a way that had no clean solution. She climbed the stairs. Her room was in the west wing, which had been her room since the 2nd year of their marriage, when the pretense of a shared chamber had been quietly retired by mutual, unspoken agreement. It was a fine room, large windows, good furniture, a view of the grounds that was genuinely beautiful in certain lights. It had everything a comfortable captivity required. She sat at her vanity and looked at her own face, 34 years old. The burgundy gown she had chosen with such specific intentionality this morning. The careful, architectural makeup she had applied with the precision of a woman who understood that appearance was the last territory remaining to her. Dark hair that had not gone gray yet, which she was aware was not a victory so much as a postponement. Brown eyes that her mother had called intelligent, and Cedric had never described at all. She began to remove the pins from her hair. It was in this mechanical, private moment, the particular intimacy of a woman taking apart the version of herself she had built for public consumption, that the things she had been holding in her chest all evening began to crack. Not dramatically, not with sobs, just a slow structural failure, a wall that had been under pressure for too long finally developing a fracture line. She sat at her vanity and watched her own hand shake, just slightly, with a tremor so controlled it was almost elegant, and she thought about what it felt like to kneel. Not the physical fact of it, the internal fact of it. What it felt like to make that calculation, to know that the dignified option and the survival option were not the same option, and to choose survival because the alternative was worse, and then to live, after, in the body that made that choice. She thought about her mother. Genevieve Ashcombe had died when Evelyn was 19, 3 weeks after the marriage contract was signed. Genevieve had been a woman of small words and large silences, a woman who communicated in gestures rather than declarations, who had pressed her daughter's face between her palms on the last afternoon they had been in the same room and looked at her with an expression that Evelyn had spent 15 years trying to correctly decode. It had not looked like an apology. It had looked like something stranger, like a woman storing up her child's face because she knew something the child did not know yet and was not going to have the time to explain. There was a cedar chest at the foot of the bed that had come from the Ashcombe house. Evelyn had not opened it in 8 months. She could not have said exactly why she avoided it. Not entirely, not honestly. Part of it was the smell of cedar and old linen, which was the smell of a particular grief she did not always have the capacity for. Part of it was the vague, irrational sense that the chest contained things that could not be put back once they were taken out. She knelt beside it tonight. The second time in one evening she had knelt, which struck her with a black humor she did not share with anyone, and opened it. Her mother's shawl on top, the small portrait miniature in its tarnished silver frame, a bundle of letters tied with brown cord, and beneath the letters, which Evelyn had read many times, beneath the layers of careful, ordinary preservation, a different letter. She had found it once, 3 years ago, and put it back without reading it past the opening line. She was not entirely sure why. She suspected she had not been ready. She suspected there were things she could not have absorbed at 31 that she was able to absorb now, at 34, after tonight, after kneeling twice in one evening and choosing survival both times. The letter was old. The paper had gone soft at the folds. The handwriting was her mother's, but different from her mother's usual hand. More urgent, less careful. The letters uneven in the way of someone writing quickly or writing through some large emotion that was difficult to regulate. "My darling girl," it began, "there is something I have carried for your entire life that I should have told you years ago. I was afraid. I am still afraid. But if you are reading this, I am probably no longer in a position to be afraid, and so I will tell you what I knew and what I hid and what I am sorry for." The candle on the vanity guttered. Evelyn's hands had stopped trembling. Her eyes moved down the page. She read the next line, then the next. Then she read a name written in her mother's handwriting, in this old urgent script, in the middle of a sentence that explained something that could not be explained, and then explained it anyway. And the world she had been standing in for 34 years tilted on its axis, not metaphorically, physically. She put one hand on the floor to steady herself, and the cold of the stone came through her palm, and she read the name again. Outside the window, snow had begun to fall on the Ravenshade grounds, silent and patient and indifferent to everything that was happening inside the West Wing bedroom of a woman who was not, it turned out, the person she had believed herself to be. She sat on the floor with her back against the cedar chest, and her mother's letter in her hands, and she read it 3 more times, and on the third reading she stopped crying. She had not noticed she had started, and something happened inside her chest where the cracked wall had been. Not healing. That was too gentle a word for it, too soft-edged. Something colder, something that had architecture, something that looked a great deal like the beginning of a plan. She had knelt twice in one evening. She would never kneel again, but neither would she run. Not yet. Not until she understood the full dimensions of the weapon she had just found at the bottom of a cedar chest, wrapped in the handwriting of a woman who had been afraid her entire life and had left her daughter something extraordinary anyway. The letter named a man, a name she recognized. Everyone in the Empire recognized it. a name that sat at the summit of the South's power like a stone that had always been there, immovable and inevitable. Grand Duke Lucien Valemont. Her mother had loved him. Her mother had kept his secret and her own and hers for 34 years. And somewhere in the capital, in the winter palace of the most feared house in the Southern Territories, was a man who did not know he had a daughter. A man who, if he did know, Evelyn folded the letter, carefully, precisely, along the original folds. She did not know yet what she was going to do. She did not know if the letter was proof enough, or who would have to be convinced, or what the cost of the truth would be when she finally chose to spend it. But she knew this. Cedric had spent 7 years learning the exact shape of her helplessness. He had measured it, mapped it, relied on it with the confidence of a man who had checked the exits and found them all sealed. He had not checked this one, because he had not known it existed. Neither had she. Until tonight. The letter sat on the vanity table when she woke up. She had not put it there. She had fallen asleep on the floor with her back against the cedar chest, the paper folded in her hand, and at some point in the night her body had made the practical decision to move to the bed without consulting her mind about it. But the letter was on the vanity, precisely centered, which meant some part of her, the part that survived on instinct when the thinking part went under, had placed it there deliberately, visible, a thing that needed to be looked at in daylight before she decided what it was. She sat up and looked at it for a long time without touching it. Outside the window, the Ravenshade grounds were white. The snow from the night before had continued through the dark hours and laid itself down over the formal gardens with a thoroughness that erased all the careful human architecture beneath it. The hedgerows, the stone paths, the ornamental pond her mother-in-law had commissioned, and Evelyn had always privately found ugly. All of it gone. Just white, and the gray sky above it, and the silence of a world that had covered itself over. She thought, that is what he is trying to do to you, not kill you, cover you. Then she got up, washed her face in cold water, dressed without calling for a maid, and picked up the letter. The second reading in daylight was different from the third reading at midnight. Midnight stripped everything down to emotional response, grief, shock, the vertiginous rearrangement of identity. Daylight asked harder questions. Daylight wanted to know about evidence, about corroboration, about the distance between a dying woman's handwritten confession and a claim that would hold up in front of a court of nobles who had every political incentive to disbelieve it. Her mother had been specific. That was the thing she had not fully absorbed the night before. Genevieve Ashcombe had not written in the vague, impressionistic language of a woman processing emotion. She had written dates, locations, the name of the inn in the southern port city where she had met Lucien Valemont during the Winter Trade Summit 35 years ago. She had written about the correspondence that followed, letters, she said, that she had kept, that she had hidden, that she had placed somewhere Evelyn would find if she looked in the right place, in the right room, at the right moment. Look for the blue tin in the Ashcombe house, the letter said, in the east parlor behind the panel beneath the window seat. The letters are there. They were always there. I could not burn them. I tried. The Ashcombe house, which now belonged to her cousin Bernard, who had taken possession of the estate upon Genevieve's death, and who had, in the intervening 15 years, made absolutely no effort to contact Evelyn except twice, once to inform her that the property had been transferred, and once to request her signature on a document releasing her claim to a disputed piece of outbuilding. Bernard was not an obstacle exactly. He was more like a gate that required the right approach. Bernard responded to one thing reliably, which was the sense that a more powerful person was paying attention. She needed to get to the Ashcombe house. She needed to do it without Cedric knowing where she was going or why. She folded the letter back into the cedar chest, beneath the shawl, beneath the portrait miniature. Then she went downstairs to begin the performance of an ordinary morning, which was the only kind of performance she had ever really mastered. The breakfast room was empty except for the lesser staff doing the final table setup. She ate alone, which was not unusual. She reviewed the household accounts, which Mrs. Harlan, the head housekeeper, delivered with the particular careful neutrality of a woman who had witnessed the previous evening and was not going to discuss it. Evelyn thanked her. Mrs. Harlan left. The account showed nothing out of order except a new line item for personal expenditure from Cedric's household discretionary fund, a sum that was large enough to be notable and attributed to wardrobe, which was not a category that had ever appeared in the Ravenshade accounts before, because the Duke had always preferred to keep his personal expenditures off the household ledger. Lillian's wardrobe, then, charged to the estate. Evelyn wrote the amount in her private notebook in the small, precise numerals she used for things she intended to remember. She was writing the third entry of the morning when Cedric came in. He was dressed for riding, which meant he had already made a decision about the day that did not include the house, which was useful information. He poured coffee and stood at the window, looking at the snow-covered grounds, with the expression of a man who owns things and is taking inventory of them. "I need to visit the Ashcombe property," Evelyn said, without looking up from the accounts. "Bernard has written about a question of household inventory from the estate. I should address it before the year end." Cedric did not turn from the window. "Bernard can address his own inventory questions. The items in question came from my mother's personal effects, which makes them technically still subject to the original estate agreement." She turned a page. "I won't be gone more than 2 days." "You'll be gone one day." He turned now, and the look he gave her was the kind of assessing look that meant he was deciding whether this was worth engaging with. "Take the smaller carriage. Don't make it an occasion." "Of course." He set down his coffee and left. The whole exchange had lasted approximately 90 seconds, which was the length most of their conversations had been for the past 2 years. Just long enough to establish that the conversation had happened, not long enough for either of them to say anything that would require a response. She waited until she heard the stable-yard sounds that meant he had ridden out. Then she went to find Thomas. Thomas Greer had been her personal footman since the first year of the marriage. He was 47, quiet in the way of a man who had chosen silence as a professional tool rather than a personal characteristic, and possessed of a loyalty she had tested twice in difficult circumstances and found reliable both times. He was also the only person in the Ravenshade household who did not reflexively check the eastern corridor, where Lillian's new rooms were, before deciding how to respond to Evelyn's requests. She found him in the side corridor outside the silver room and spoke to him in a voice that did not require lowering because it was already calibrated for exactly the distance between two people standing close together with a specific purpose. "I need the carriage ready before noon," she said, "and I need you to understand that the nature of this trip does not require documentation in the household log." Thomas looked at her for one beat. "The Ashcombe house, my lady?" "Yes. Roads passable despite the snow. We'd be there by late afternoon." "Good. And shall I—" He paused in the particular way he had, which meant the next part of the sentence was the part that mattered. "Shall I advise anyone of our route?" "No," she said. "You shall not." He nodded once, with the economy of a man who had already moved the conversation into the category of completed decisions. The drive to the Ashcombe estate took 3 hours on winter roads. She sat in the carriage with the letter in her coat pocket and watched the landscape change from the manicured severity of Ravenshade territory to the older, softer country of the eastern holdings. The roads less even, the trees closer to the verges, the farmhouses smaller and more honest-looking in the way of places that had never had the resources to perform grandeur. She had grown up in this country. She had thought she remembered it. She was surprised, sitting in the carriage watching the familiar shapes of hills she had not seen in 8 years, by how much her body remembered independently of her mind. The particular way the valley opened before the Ashcombe gatehouse, the smell of the river that ran alongside the south field. Small things. The kind of things that go into storage without being filed, because the person who stored them could not have known they would matter. Bernard was not home. His housekeeper, a thin woman named Agnes with the expression of someone who has managed difficult personalities for decades and has developed an impenetrable serenity about it, told her that the young master was at the capital for the season and was not expected back before March. Evelyn received this information without expression and asked if she might have access to the east parlor to retrieve some personal items belonging to her late mother. Agnes showed her in. The east parlor was exactly as she remembered it, and also completely wrong in the way that rooms you have not been in for many years are always wrong. The dimensions familiar, the specific gravity of the space familiar, but everything shifted slightly, rearranged by time and other people's occupancy into a version of the room that existed in a different story than the one she had lived in. The furniture was different. Bernard had cleared out the older pieces and replaced them with things that were more fashionable and less interesting. The wallpaper had been rehung, but the window seat was original. She crossed to it and knelt. The third time in 3 days she had knelt, and this time she did it with a purpose so specific that it did not feel like kneeling at all. And she pressed along the lower panel beneath the seat with her palm until she found the place where the wood gave fractionally, where the panel was mounted differently than the panels on either side, where someone had once made a small, careful alteration to the architecture for private reasons. The panel came free. Inside, a tin box, blue, the paint faded to gray at the corners. Small enough to fit in 2 hands. Heavy enough that she held her breath when she lifted it. She did not open it in the parlor. She thanked Agnes, secured the tin in the inner pocket of her traveling coat, and returned to the carriage. She sat with her hands folded on top of the tin for the entire first hour of the return drive, while the winter light failed around the carriage, and Thomas navigated the darkening road, and she breathed carefully and thought about the difference between having a secret and having a weapon. Weapons required knowledge of how to use them. They required understanding the terrain, the distance, the specific resistance of the target. They required the kind of cold patience that was different from passive endurance, active, deliberate, pointed patience. The patience of someone who is not waiting for rescue, but is instead waiting for the right angle. She opened the tin. The letters were bundled in 3 groups, tied with different colored cord. She counted, 22 letters in total, spanning what the dates told her was a period of approximately 4 years, from the winter summit 35 years ago to an abrupt stop that coincided, she calculated, with the period of her mother's engagement to her father, her official father. Lord Ashcombe, who had been a good man in the limited way of good men, and who had loved his daughter with a complete and uncomplicated affection that she thought about now with something complicated and tender and not fully nameable. The handwriting on the letters was not her mother's. It was large and controlled, the pen pressure heavy. The letters formed with the particular confidence of a man accustomed to having his written word carry consequence. She read the first one, then the second, then sat with the third letter unopened in her hands and looked out the carriage window at the dark fields passing. The language in the letters was not political. It was not the language of alliance or transaction. It was the language of someone trying to articulate something large with instruments that were not quite adequate to the task. Not poetry, not sentiment, but a kind of urgent precision. "I have thought of the particular way you argue," one letter said, "and found myself constructing counter-arguments at 3 in the morning as a form of conversation that you are not present for. This seems to be a permanent condition." Another, "I'm aware that there are 14 practical reasons why this cannot continue. I am also aware that I have run out of interest in practical reasons." She sat with those letters in her lap for a long time. He had not known. That was what she kept returning to. Lucien Vallemont had not known she existed. Her mother had made a choice. Whatever that choice had cost, whatever it had been made of, fear or practicality or a genuine belief that it was the kindest option, and she had made it alone. And a man somewhere in the South Capital had lived for 34 years with a gap in his accounting that he did not know was there. She arrived back at Ravenshade after midnight. Thomas took the carriage without being asked. She went upstairs without encountering anyone. She put the tin in the cedar chest and sat on the edge of the bed and thought about what came next with the concentrated focus of a woman who has, for the first time in a very long time, something to protect. The days that followed settled into a new pattern, which was the old pattern but with different weight to it. Cedric was present at dinner on 3 of the next 7 evenings. The other 4 evenings he was absent without explanation, which had been the case often enough in the past year that the staff had stopped noting it in their expressions. Lillian was visible in the East Wing. Evelyn heard her voice sometimes, that particular quality of unguarded laughter that carried through old stone walls, and occasionally saw her crossing the ground floor corridor with the small, slightly self-conscious posture of a person who has been told she belongs somewhere and almost believes it. On the 8th day, Cedric informed Evelyn at breakfast that she was to vacate the West Wing sitting room. He said it the way you relay a scheduling change. "I'll need the West sitting room for guest accommodation. Arrange your things." She looked up from her tea. "That is my sitting room. It's a room in my house." He turned a page of the paper he was reading. "I need it. Move your things to the smaller study on the 2nd floor." She moved her things to the smaller study on the 2nd floor. She did it herself, or with Thomas's help, rather than asking the household staff, because the household staff would have done it with the particular careful sympathy that she found at this stage more corrosive than contempt. Sympathy was a form of agreement that you were losing. She did not want anyone's agreement about that. The West sitting room was cleaned, refurnished, and given to Lillian within the week. Evelyn noted the date and added it to the notebook. It was in the 2nd week of January that Mrs. Harlan came to her with the accounts and did not leave when the accounts were finished. She stood in the doorway of the small second-floor study with her hands folded and her expression carrying the weight of a woman who has been building toward a sentence for some time. "My lady," Mrs. Harlan said, "there are some things I feel I should tell you." "Then sit down," Evelyn said, "and tell me." What Mrs. Harlan told her took 40 minutes. She was a methodical woman, and she delivered the information in the order it had occurred to her, which was roughly chronological, with occasional corrections when her memory offered a more accurate sequence. Evelyn listened without interrupting. What she learned: Cedric had retained a legal consultant from the capital, not his usual family solicitor, but an outside firm, one that specialized in what Mrs. Harlan carefully called arrangements of marital dissolution. The consultant had visited the estate twice, the second time staying overnight. On the second visit, Lillian had been present for part of the meeting. After the meeting, Cedric had been, in Mrs. Harlan's careful phrasing, in notably improved spirits for the remainder of the week. What she also learned: several of the senior household staff had received quiet inquiries about their continued employment under new house management, inquiries that had been framed as informal but had carried the specificity of something being arranged rather than speculated about. Two of the younger maids, both of whom had been explicitly loyal to Evelyn in small ways that the house hierarchy tracked, and everyone understood, had been reassigned to duties that removed them from proximity to Evelyn's rooms and schedule, and someone had gone through the correspondence on Evelyn's desk. Mrs. Harlan said this last part looking at the window rather than at Evelyn, which was the housekeeper's version of deep discomfort. "I cannot say for certain who. I only know that when I was dusting on Thursday morning, the arrangement of the papers was not as you'd left it. I noticed these things." "I know you do," Evelyn said. "Thank you, Mrs. Harlan." After the housekeeper left, Evelyn moved the tin from the cedar chest to a location she selected with more care. The legal consultation was the detail that mattered most. Not because it was surprising. She had been tracking the logic of Cedric's behavior, and the destination of that logic had been clear enough. But because it meant a clock existed now. Somewhere in the machinery of the capital, there was a process that had been set in motion. And processes, once set in motion, had their own momentum. She did not know the timeline. She did not know what ground Cedric intended to claim, or whether he had already begun cultivating the social groundwork that would make those grounds legible to the people whose opinion mattered. What she knew was that she could not build what she needed to build at the speed of a woman waiting to be acted upon. She needed to make contact. The problem of making contact with Grand Duke Lucien Vallemont was not a small problem. She could not write to him directly. Any letter leaving Ravenshade was potentially subject to Cedric's awareness, and more fundamentally, she had no established connection, no intermediary, no pretext that would not look from the outside like exactly what it was. The court moved on relationships, and relationships had to be established through channels, and the channels she had access to were thin and mostly compromised. But she had one. Lady Constance Whitmore was 63 years old and had known Evelyn's mother from girlhood, which was the origin of a relationship that had never become close and had also never entirely gone dormant. She wrote to Evelyn twice a year with the regularity of someone discharging a pleasant obligation, and Evelyn had always written back with careful warmth because Lady Whitmore was connected to every significant house in both the North and the South in the way that certain women of her generation were. Not through power exactly, but through the long accumulated tissue of social relationship that had more practical value than power in specific situations. Lady Whitmore had, at various points in the past decade, corresponded with the Vallemont household in her capacity as a patron of the Southern Arts Foundation. It was not much. It was a thread. Evelyn wrote the letter in the small second-floor study with the door locked, by hand, in the specific careful language of a woman who knows the letter may be read by someone other than its intended recipient. She wrote nothing that was not deniable. She asked after Lady Whitmore's health, mentioned that she might be in the capital in the spring, suggested that she would value the opportunity to pay her respects to any number of notable houses, if Lady Whitmore might be willing to make an introduction or two. The subtext was legible only to someone who was looking for it, and Lady Whitmore was someone who had spent 63 years reading subtext. She gave the letter to Thomas with specific instructions about its routing. Then she went back to the performance of her days, which she maintained with the disciplined attention of someone who understands that the performance itself is a form of intelligence gathering. She attended the household meetings. She reviewed the accounts. She sat at dinner on the evenings Cedric was present and spoke when spoken to and observed everything. She learned that 2 additional senior staff members had been approached. She learned that the legal consultant had been retained on a formal basis. She learned from an overheard fragment in the East Corridor that Lillian had asked Cedric what would happen to the other one, and that Cedric had told her not to worry about it. The other one. Eveline stood in the corridor for a moment after the voices passed, in the particular stillness of a woman who is deciding whether a thing has the power to hurt her or not. She decided it did not. She went back to the study and opened the notebook and added the date. The letter from Lady Whitmore came 11 days later. It was warm, chatty, full of the specific social detail that was Lady Whitmore's native language. And in the middle of the 3rd paragraph, with no particular change in tone, she mentioned that she had recently been in correspondence with the steward of House Valamont regarding the spring concert series and had found him most receptive to the idea of new introductions from trusted circles. She mentioned a name, a title, a suggested method of contact that would, she wrote, provide a suitable context for a first acquaintance. Eveline read the paragraph 3 times. Then she folded the letter, added it to the tin, and sat very still for approximately 5 minutes. Somewhere in the South Capital, in the winter palace of the most feared house in the Southern Territories, there was a man who did not know she existed. And now, for the first time, there was a thread, thin, unconfirmed, requiring everything to go right, connecting her to the room where she could introduce herself. Not as Evelyn Ashcombe Ravenshade, the Duchess being quietly erased from her own life, as someone else entirely. She was still sitting with that thought when the door to the study opened. Cedric did not knock on doors inside his own house. He never had. He stood in the doorway of the small second-floor study in his riding clothes, with the cold from outside still on him, and looked at the desk where she was sitting and then at her face with the particular assessing qualities she had learned to read precisely. He was looking for something specific, something he was trying to determine the presence or absence of before he spoke. She met his eyes and gave him nothing. "You had correspondence this week," he said. "I correspond regularly," she said. "It is one of the functions of a duchess." "Whitmore," he said. "What does Constance Whitmore want?" "She wanted to know how I was." She turned a page of the accounts she had been working on before the letter arrived and was still technically working on. "I told her I was well. She told me about the spring concert series." It was a brief exchange. He was quiet for a moment. The quality of his silence had changed in the past weeks. Less bored, more attentive, the silence of a man who was recalibrating something without being entirely sure why. She noted it. She filed it. "I want you to reduce your outside correspondence," he said, "for the time being." "Is there a reason?" "Yes," he said. "There is. You don't need to know what it is." She looked up from the accounts then, directly at him, with the steady, unhurried regard of a woman who has recently acquired, without his knowledge, something that changes the math of this room entirely. "All right," she said. He waited for more. She did not give him more. He left. She listened to his footsteps go down the corridor, measured their pace and direction, and when they were far enough away, she opened the desk drawer and removed the notebook. She had been keeping entries in a small enough hand that the entire record of the past 4 months fit in 14 pages. She turned to page 15. She wrote the date. She wrote, "He is watching the correspondence. He does not yet know what I know. He is moving faster than I anticipated." She paused, pen in hand. "I cannot wait for spring." She wrote one more line. Then she closed the notebook. Outside the window of the small second-floor study, the January cold had settled into the Ravenshade grounds with the permanence of a thing that intended to stay. The formal gardens were still buried. The pond was still erased. The hedgerows, the paths, the careful human architecture of a house that had been built to last generations. All of it still under the same white silence. She thought about what lived under snow. Everything was the answer. Everything lived under snow. It was not absence. It was just a different kind of presence, dormant, gathered, waiting for the precise moment when conditions changed. She stood up. She put the notebook in the tin. She put the tin in the place she had selected with more care than the cedar chest. Then she walked to the window and looked out at the grounds of a house that had been built to intimidate and had spent 7 years trying to diminish her and had, she was now quietly, completely certain, made its one critical mistake. It had given her time. It had given her the kind of time that looks, from the outside, like defeat. The slow months of restriction, isolation, and systematic erasure that a man performs on a woman he has already decided is finished. Time during which no one was watching carefully because the outcome seemed settled. Time during which a woman with a cedar chest and a blue tin and a letter from her dead mother and a name she had not yet claimed could build something that had no visible surface, no observable progress, nothing that could be intercepted or redirected. She had 11 pages of documentation. She had 22 letters in a dead man's hand that established, with the specificity of dates and locations, a fact about her blood that the court would not be able to easily dismiss. She had a thread to the Valamont household that was thin but present. She had a housekeeper who was loyal, and a footman who was discreet, and a notebook that recorded in small, careful numerals every act of dispossession that Cedric had committed against her since November. She had a name she had never used. She pressed her palm flat against the cold window glass and looked out at the buried grounds and thought about the spring concert series in the capital and the name Lady Whitmore had given her and the suggested method of contact and what it would require to be standing in the right room at the right moment in front of the right man and say, for the first time in her life, out loud, in front of a witness, "My name is Evelyn Valamont." Not a request, not a petition, a statement of fact, backed by 22 letters and the particular dangerous certainty of a woman who has spent 4 months kneeling and has run, with complete finality, out of patience for it. The cold came through the glass into her palm. She did not move her hand. She stood there until the cold became something she was holding rather than something being done to her. And then she turned away from the window and walked to the door. And when she opened it and stepped into the corridor of a house that had spent years trying to convince her she was invisible, she looked for the first time like a woman who was about to make a very large amount of noise. The letter to the Valamont steward took her 4 days to write, not because the words were difficult. The words, once she had accepted what she was doing, came with a clarity that surprised her. It was the calibration that took time. Too much, and she would appear desperate, which was the single quality she could not afford to project into a room she had not yet entered. Too little, and the letter would read as social correspondence, the kind that got filed and forgotten and answered 3 months later by a junior secretary with a form response. She needed to land in the precise middle, specific enough to signal that she had something real, restrained enough to suggest that she understood the weight of what she was approaching and was not frightened by it. She wrote it in the early morning hours before the house was fully awake, in the small study with the door locked and the single lamp turned low. She wrote it in her plainest hand, without flourish. She signed it with her birth name only, Evelyn Ashcombe, and felt the strangeness of that, the way a name you have not used in 14 years sits differently in the hand than the name you have been carrying. She gave it to Thomas on a Thursday, with specific routing instructions that bypassed the Ravenshade postal account entirely. Thomas received it with the expression he used for things that required no discussion. She trusted that expression. She had audited it twice in difficult circumstances and found it sound. What she did not know, could not have known, because the one variable she had failed to account for was the one that lived closest to her, was that Thomas had received a different kind of conversation 4 days before that Thursday. She found out on a Tuesday. It was 11 in the morning, and she was in the East Library reviewing a set of land documents that Mrs. Harlan had flagged as potentially relevant to the year-end accounting, and Cedric walked in. Not the usual entrance, not the rolling up of sleeves, end-of-evening indifference. He walked in the way he walked into rooms when he had already decided the room belonged to him in a specific and immediate way, with the door shut behind him and the particular quality of attention that meant he was not here to have a conversation, but to conduct one. He had a letter in his hand, not her letter to the Valamont steward, something smaller, a different sheet of paper folded once. He held it at his side with the careless confidence of a man who has already read it and has had time to decide what it means. "Sit down," he said. She was already sitting. She looked at him and did not move. "I said sit." He stopped, looked at her in the chair. The muscle in his jaw flexed once. "Fine." He put the letter on the desk between them. She looked at it without touching it. It was written in Thomas's hand. 3 short paragraphs. The routing instructions she had given him, transcribed with the particular accuracy of a man with a good memory who had been asked to reproduce something precisely. The room went very quiet inside her, not the external room. The external room had the ordinary sounds of a January morning, the distant sound of the ground staff, the creak of the old building adjusting to the cold. The quiet was internal. the specific cellular quiet that the body produces when it has received information that requires a complete reconfiguration of its understanding of the present moment. She had experienced it before, reading her mother's letter, but that had been the quiet of discovery. This was the quiet of loss. She looked at Thomas's handwriting for approximately 4 seconds. Then she looked up at Cedric. "How much did you pay him?" she said. Not a question, a request for a specific number. "That's what you want to know?" He pulled a chair from against the wall and sat down across from her, forearms on the desk, with the focused attention of a man who has been building toward a scene and has arrived at it. "Not whether I read the letter, not who else has seen it. How much?" "Those are all secondary questions," she said. "The first question is how much, because it tells me what he decided you were worth." Something moved in Cedric's face. Not respect. She did not expect respect, but a fractional recalibration, the expression of a man who has prepared for a specific kind of response and has received a different one. He filed it. He moved on. "Thomas has been sharing your correspondence and your movements for 6 weeks," Cedric said, "since before your trip to the Ashcombe property." The Ashcombe property. She kept her face still and thought, "He knows I went there. He knows what I went to get." She did not know how much further the knowledge extended. She sat with that uncertainty and breathed through it. 6 weeks, she said. "He told me about the tin. There it was." She felt it land the way a physical impact lands, a moment of pure sensation before the interpretation catches up. She had moved the tin. She had moved it after Mrs. Harlan's warning to a location she had chosen with care. But Thomas had known the original location. Thomas had helped her carry the cedar chest years ago when she moved into the West Wing. Thomas had been present in the room when she opened it. "What exactly did he tell you about the tin?" she said. "That it contains letters, that you brought it back from your mother's house." Cedric leaned back slightly, crossing one ankle over his knee in the posture of a man allowing himself a controlled comfort. "He doesn't know the contents. He isn't a reader, apparently, Thomas. A useful quality in some contexts." She breathed. The letters were still intact. That was the first thing. The letters were still intact and in her possession, and Thomas had not physically accessed them, which meant Cedric knew a tin existed and knew she had retrieved it, and knew it contained letters, but did not know whose letters, or what they said, or what her mother had written in the document that sat beneath them. She was a woman standing in a room that had just had most of its floor removed, looking down at the remaining boards, calculating whether they would hold. "I want to understand the scope of this," she said. Her voice was level. She thought distantly about how often in her life she had been proud of her voice for remaining level, and what it said about the life she had constructed that this was something to be proud of. "Are you telling me this as a warning or as a closing statement?" "As a statement of fact." He picked up the transcribed letter and looked at it for a moment with the expression of someone reviewing a completed task. "You wrote to the Whitmore woman. She put you in contact with someone in the Valamont household. You were attempting to arrange an introduction to the Grand Duke." He paused. "That's an interesting ambition for a woman in your position." She said nothing. "What I want to know," Cedric said, and his voice dropped into the quieter register he used when he was being genuinely direct rather than performing directness, "is what you think you have. What is in that tin that you think is worth presenting to Lucien Valamont?" The question hung in the room. She understood in the space of that hanging that this was the actual crux of the conversation. Not the letter, not Thomas, not the 6 weeks of surveillance. All of that was preamble. He had brought her to this room and this desk and this confrontation because he was trying to read her, and specifically trying to read whether what she had was real. Whether the threat that the tin represented, whatever he suspected or feared it might contain, was something he needed to neutralize immediately, or something he could simply control by controlling her access to the outside world. She gave him nothing. "Letters from my mother," she said. "Personal correspondence. Nothing that would interest you." He looked at her for a long time. He was good at this. The sustained direct look that was designed to apply pressure to the space between what a person was saying and what they were actually thinking. She had spent years learning to hold ground in that space. "Personal correspondence with whom?" he said. "Old friends of hers, women from her girlhood." She held his gaze. "Constance Whitmore was among them. That is why I wrote to Lady Whitmore. Old connection, nothing more." The silence stretched. She could hear her own pulse in the middle distance of her own skull. that interior metronome she had learned to listen to as a gauge of her actual state behind the performed state. Cedric stood up. He picked up the transcribed letter and folded it and put it in his coat pocket. Then he looked at her with the expression of a man who has made a decision, not the decision he came in expecting to make, but the decision the information has handed him. "I'm going to need you to give me the tin," he said. "No," she said. The word came out before the calculation had finished. She registered that. She registered that her body had answered before her strategy had caught up, which meant the strategy and the body were, for once, in agreement, that there was no version of handing over the tin that was not a final, irreversible act of surrender. Cedric went very still. In 14 years of marriage, she could count on one hand the number of times she had said no to him in a direct exchange. Not the evasions, not the managed deflections, not the careful architecture of compliance that was her usual instrument. The direct word. He was not accustomed to it. She watched him reacquaint himself with it in real time, the way a man recalibrates when the ground responds differently than it should. "Evelyn." "No," she said again. Steadier now, the strategy having arrived to confirm what the body already knew. "Those are my mother's belongings. They are not subject to your authority over this estate. Everything in this estate is governed by the original Ashcombe-Ravenshade marriage agreement." She stood up. She had not planned to stand. She stood because the body decided again, and the body was right. Standing changed the geometry of the room, which specifies in the 6th clause that personal property belonging to the bride's family line remains under her individual custodianship regardless of the estate's ownership transfer. "I have read that document. I doubt you have." He stared at her. "I will consult with the solicitor," he said. "Please do," she said. "I believe you'll find I'm correct." He left. She stood behind the desk in the East Library for a long time after he was gone, with her hands pressed flat on the surface of the desk, breathing with the deliberate care of someone managing an interior structural situation. The floor had several boards missing, and she was still standing. That was the accounting. That was what mattered right now. Thomas. She sat with the specific quality of that for a moment, separate from the strategic problem, because it deserved that much, but a moment of honest acknowledgement. 14 years. The man had carried things for her, shielded her from small indignities, received information she could not safely hold anywhere else. She had trusted him in the way you trust someone who has passed enough small tests that the larger trust feels earned. She had not considered, with enough seriousness, that the small tests and the large test were different categories of pressure, and that a man might pass all the small ones and fail the large one, and that she would only find out which was which when the large one arrived. She thought about what it cost a footman, in this world, to be loyal to the losing side. She thought about what Cedric had offered him. She did not know if it was money or position or the simple, terrible calculus of a man protecting his own future employment in a house where it was becoming increasingly clear which direction power was moving. She did not forgive it, but she understood the arithmetic, and understanding the arithmetic meant she could not hate him with any clean simplicity, which was its own kind of loss. She went upstairs and moved the tin again. The new location was not in the house. That was the decision that arrived while she was walking up the stairs. The sudden cold clarity that any location inside Ravenshade Manor was potentially compromised now, that Cedric had 6 weeks of intelligence about her movements and her habits and her resources, that the walls of this building were no longer a kind of privacy, but a kind of exposure. She thought of the groundskeeper's tool cottage at the edge of the south garden, which she had inspected twice in the past year as part of the general estate accounting, and which had a locked side room that was used for seed storage, a room for which she had the key in her household management set, a room that Cedric had never in 14 years of occupying this estate shown any interest in whatsoever. She wrapped the tin in oilcloth. She put it in the deep inner pocket of the heaviest winter coat she owned. She went outside in the cold January afternoon under the pretense of walking the grounds, which she did periodically and which was, blessedly, still unremarkable. And she walked to the cottage and opened the side room and found a place behind the seed barrels, wrapped the tin further in a grain sack and set it in the dark. Then she walked back to the house. It was in the 6 days following Thomas's exposure that the remaining architecture came down. Cedric met with the solicitor on the 2nd day. On the 3rd day, Evelyn was informed by the household steward, not Mrs. Harlan, a different man, one she did not recognize, which was information in itself, that her access to the household accounts was being suspended pending a review of the estate management structure. On the fourth day, she arrived at the East Library to find it locked and the key removed from her household set. On the fifth day, the remaining 2 staff members she had considered reliable were reassigned. Not fired, reassigned. To duties in other parts of the estate, duties that simply placed them, by the natural logic of the workday, in positions where they would not routinely be in proximity to her. She was not technically a prisoner. She could move through the house, she could walk the grounds, she could eat her meals, which were served to her punctually and without any obvious reduction in quality, as though the deprivation happening at every other level was being deliberately balanced against the provision of adequately cooked food. She could see visitors, though no visitors came. She could not send correspondence. Not because it was formally prohibited. The prohibition was softer and more thorough than that. It was that every exit for a letter had been closed. Thomas was gone from her service. The household mail was now managed by the unfamiliar steward. There was no one she trusted with something small enough to leave the estate without being noticed. On the 6th day, Cedric called her to the main study. The main study was a room she associated with the performance of authority, heavy furniture, the Ravenshade family portraits in their ranked severity, the desk positioned so that whoever sat behind it occupied a position of deliberate visual elevation. Cedric sat behind it. He was in formal day dress, which was unusual for an in-house meeting, and she understood immediately that this too was a choice. Across from the desk there was no chair. She stood. "I've had the solicitor review the marriage agreement," he said, without preamble. "He confirms your reading of the 6th clause is technically correct. The items in the tin, whatever they are, remain under your custodianship." She waited. However, he opened a folder on the desk and looked at a document she could not read from the distance he had placed her at. "The grounds for dissolution are more substantial than I initially indicated. The legal consultant's assessment is that a petition to the Imperial Family Court would succeed, given adequate preparation." He closed the folder. "The timeline is approximately 4 months. 4 months." She held that number in the part of her mind that did the structural accounting and felt the weight of it. 4 months was faster than she had estimated. 4 months meant the spring concert series was not a safe timeline. 4 months meant that whatever she was building needed to be built faster, or it would be overtaken by what he was building. "I am prepared to offer you a settlement," Cedric said. "An income, a small property, one of the eastern cottages, something appropriate to your station. The dissolution would be framed in terms that do not publicly damage your reputation." He paused. "You would be free to live quietly." Quietly. The word sat in the room like an object. She looked at it. "You want me to take the settlement," she said. "I want this to be clean," he said, and the word want was doing a lot of work in that sentence, carrying in its brief syllable the entire history of a man who had grown accustomed to having his wants answered by the structure of the world he lived in. "I want you to understand that fighting this costs more than it gives you. You have no patron, you have no political support. The court is not going to intervene in a marital dissolution on behalf of a woman with no house behind her." He said it without cruelty, clinically, as one lays out a true assessment. "Take the settlement, live quietly. Let this end without more cost to either of us." She looked at the desk between them, at the folder containing the solicitor's assessment, at the man who had decided 14 years ago to marry her for the alliance she represented, and had spent the intervening years finding her consistently, specifically insufficient in ways that he made sure she understood with precision and regularity. She thought about the tin in the seed room. She thought about 22 letters in a large controlled hand. She thought about what her mother had written. "I tried to burn them. I could not." "I need time to consider the settlement terms," she said. Cedric's expression shifted slightly. He had expected something else. The acceptance, perhaps, or the refusal. The request for time was neutral ground, and neutral ground was hard to respond to without revealing more than you meant to. "You have 2 weeks," he said. "Thank you," she said. She turned and walked to the door. She had her hand on the frame when he spoke. "Evelyn." She stopped, did not turn. "What's in the tin?" She stood in the doorway for 1 beat. "My mother's letters," she said. "I already told you that." She walked out. The 2 weeks moved differently than the weeks before them, faster on the surface, denser underneath. She had lost Thomas, the household accounts, the library, and 2 staff members. She had gained, from the conversation in the main study, a specific and useful piece of information. Cedric did not know what was in the tin. His request confirmed that. If he had known, if Thomas had been more thorough, or if someone else had accessed the seed room, or if the contents had been identified, the conversation would have been different. He would not have offered a settlement. He would have moved differently. He was operating on suspicion. The suspicion that whatever she had retrieved from the Ashcombe property was significant, but suspicion without specific knowledge was manageable. Suspicion without specific knowledge could be lived alongside. She needed to reach the Valamont household before the 4 months expired. With Thomas gone and the correspondence routes closed, the direct written approach was no longer viable. She needed a physical presence in a room where the right person would be. She needed the kind of introduction that could not be intercepted because it happened in person, in public, in front of witnesses. She needed the capital. The difficulty was that she had no established reason to go to the capital before spring, and any manufactured reason would be visible as exactly that. She sat with this problem for 4 days, turning it in her mind with the methodical attention she gave to accounting problems that did not initially balance. And on the 5th day, the solution presented itself in the form of a detail so ordinary that she almost dismissed it before understanding what it was. Lady Alderton's Winter Charity Exhibition. It was held every February in the capital's Civic Gallery, and it was one of the few events that drew attendance from across the full spectrum of the noble houses without requiring a direct invitation. It was open to any noble patron, attended by everyone because it was politically neutral ground, and notable primarily for the consistent attendance of houses that avoided each other in more formal settings. It was, in the specific language of the court, a low-stakes room. She had received the standard patron's notice 3 weeks earlier. She had filed it under routine correspondence without opening it fully because she had not been thinking about the capital in those terms yet. She retrieved it now. Grand Duke Lucien Valamont was listed among the founding patrons. She sat with that for a long moment. She did not need Lady Whitmore's intermediary. She did not need a letter. She did not need an introduction arranged through the careful, slow machinery of social correspondence. She needed to be in a civic gallery in the capital on the 12th of February, which was 17 days away, and to be in the same room as a man who did not know she existed, and to find the right moment to introduce herself. The problem was getting to the capital. She was not a prisoner. She could leave. Cedric had not formally restricted her movement because formal restriction of a duchess's movement was the kind of thing that created its own complications in the court record, and Cedric was currently managing his own court record with care. But leaving required a pretext. Leaving required a reason that Cedric would accept as ordinary rather than strategic, because if he suspected she was going to the capital to do something specific, he would find a way to prevent it or follow it, and either outcome was worse than staying. She thought about this for 2 days. Then she went to Cedric at dinner and mentioned, in the tone of someone making a minor administrative remark, that she planned to attend the Alderton Charity Exhibition as she had in previous years, and that she would use the visit to call on Dr. Marchfield about the recurring winter headaches that had been troubling her since November. The headaches were real. Dr. Marchfield was a real physician who had treated her twice. The Alderton exhibition was a genuine prior commitment. Every element was true. The totality was a lie. Cedric received it with the mild attention he gave small administrative facts and said, "Fine, 3 days. Take the smaller carriage." She said, "Of course." 3 days. She had 17 days before the exhibition and 3 days in which to accomplish what the last 4 months had been building toward. 3 days to stand in a room with a man she had never met, show him letters she could not yet prove were authentic, and ask him to do something that no rational, powerful man does for a stranger. Extend the protection of his name to a woman who arrived without warning claiming to be his daughter. She did not sleep well in the 12 days between that conversation and the morning the smaller carriage came around to the front of Ravenshade Manor. She used the wakefulness productively. She reviewed what she knew about Valamont, not the court gossip, not the reputation, but the structural facts. His age, his household composition, the particular political history of House Valamont in the Southern Territories, the things a man like that protected, and the things he valued, and the things that would make him listen rather than dismiss. She thought about her mother writing, "I tried to burn them. I could not." She thought about 22 letters beginning, "My darling," and containing dates and locations that could be verified. She thought about a man who had written, "I have run out of interest in practical reasons," and had not known, for 34 years, that his impractical love had left a person alive in the world. On the morning of the 12th of February, she wrapped the tin in the oilcloth, placed it in the inner pocket of her traveling coat, and walked out of Ravenshade Manor through the front entrance, down the stone steps, and into the cold air of the early morning without looking back. The smaller carriage waited. No Thomas. A driver she knew slightly, a man named Hobbs who was steady and uninvested in the politics of the house. She got in. The door closed. The manor receded behind the carriage window. She pressed her hand against the oilcloth-wrapped tin through the coat fabric. 22 letters. The specific weight of them. The weight of what they were. She was 34 years old. She had been told, in 17 different ways over 14 years, that she had nowhere to go and no one powerful enough to stand behind her. She had been told this so consistently and with such thorough structural support. No siblings, no patrons, no political allies, no house of sufficient standing, that she had, for most of those years, believed it, not because she was weak, because the evidence was real. The evidence had been incomplete. In the capital, 17 days from now, she was going to walk into a room and introduce herself with a name she had never used to a man who did not know she existed, and she was going to do it with 22 letters in her pocket and the specific contained focus of a woman who has spent 4 months learning that everything she was told about her helplessness was built on a piece of information someone had chosen to withhold. The carriage moved through the gate. The Ravenshade grounds fell behind her. She thought about Cedric in that formal study, folder closed, waiting for her to take the settlement and disappear into a quiet eastern cottage and stop mattering. She thought about the specific comfort of his certainty. The certainty of a man who has surveyed the exits and concluded that there are none. She had not told him about the exit, because he had not asked the right question. He had asked what was in the tin. He had never asked, not once, in 14 years, in 1,000 small exchanges, the question that would have required him to be curious about her as a person, rather than a function. He had never asked who she was before she married him. The carriage hit the main road and picked up speed. She looked out the window at the February fields, bare and gray and entirely indifferent to the direction things were going, and she thought, there is no coming back from this. Whatever happens in that gallery, whatever Valamont says, whatever he believes, whatever he decides, I will have made a move that cannot be unmade. Cedric will know. The court will eventually know. There will be no version of this that ends quietly, in an eastern cottage with nobody paying attention. She had spent 4 months preparing for a fight she didn't fully know how to win. She was about to find out if the preparation was enough. And if it wasn't, if Valamont dismissed her, if the letters were deemed insufficient, if the weight of 34 years of silence proved too heavy to overturn in a single conversation in a civic gallery in the middle of February, then she was going back to a house that was closing around her, to a man with a 4-month timeline and a solicitor and the absolute confidence of someone who has already decided the outcome, and she was going to have nothing left. The carriage moved through the cold February morning. She did not look back. No, she had 17 days. In 17 days, she would either stand in a room as someone new, someone the court had no map for, someone whose name alone rearranged the architecture of every threat that had been made against her, or she would stand there as no one. There was no middle ground. There had not been middle ground since the night she opened a cedar chest in the West Wing and found, underneath the ordinary weight of grief, the specific and extraordinary fact of who she actually was. The carriage moved through the gate. Behind her, in the main study of Ravenshade Manor, Cedric Ravenshade was reading a solicitor's report with the calm attention of a man who believed completely and without reasonable doubt that the woman in the smaller carriage had nowhere to go. He was not wrong about the carriage. He was catastrophically wrong about the destination. The capital in February was a different animal than the capital in any other season. In spring it performed itself. The blossoms along the civic promenade, the carriage traffic thickening with the returning noble families, the particular social energy of a city shaking off winter like a coat and remembering that it had an audience. In summer it was loud and transactional. In autumn it was beautiful and slightly melancholic in the way of things that know they are ending. But in February the capital was stripped. The cold had taken the performance away, and what remained was the structural truth of the place, the stone of it, the hierarchy of its architecture, the way the older buildings in the civic quarter sat with their backs to the wind with the specific patience of things built to outlast weather. Eveline arrived on the morning of the 10th, 2 days before the exhibition. She had chosen the timing deliberately. One day to confirm the layout of the civic gallery, the exhibition's attending patron list, the physical arrangement of rooms. 1 day to prepare. Not to rehearse. Rehearsal implied a script, and she had spent the carriage journey understanding that no script was adequate to what she was walking into. The preparation she needed was not verbal. It was internal. It was the specific work of a woman deciding, in the deepest available part of herself, exactly how far she was willing to go. The answer, she had arrived at somewhere outside the third milestone on the Ravenshade Road, was all the way. Not recklessly. The reckless version of all the way was the version that failed. The careful version. The version that kept its face still, its voice level, its hands steady, while everything underneath was running at a different speed entirely. That was the version that had a chance. She took rooms at the Aldwell, which was a small, well-regarded establishment in the civic quarter that she had stayed at twice before, and whose staff maintained the professional discretion of people who understood that the guests who valued privacy were the guests worth keeping. She registered under her married name because she was not yet in a position to register under anything else, a fact she held in awareness without letting it become a weight. The tin went under the floorboard beside the writing table. She had checked the board on her first visit 2 years ago as part of the general low-level assessment of her physical environment that had become a habit so ingrained she no longer recognized it as unusual. It was solid, well-fitted, and undisturbed. She spent the remainder of the 10th reviewing everything she knew and did not know. She knew Lucien Vallemont was 61 years old. She knew he had governed the Southern Territories for 30 years through a combination of genuine administrative competence and the particular quality of personal authority that is not performed but simply present, the quality that makes rooms adjust when a person enters them, not because of fear exactly, but because of some older, more instinctive recognition of a person who has already decided what they are. She knew he had a legitimate heir, a son named Adrian, 29 years old, currently serving in a diplomatic posting in the Eastern Territories. She knew he had been widowed 12 years ago, that his wife had died of fever, and that the court had periodically floated the prospect of a second marriage, and he had consistently, apparently without particular emphasis, declined. She did not know if he knew about her mother's pregnancy. This was the question she had been sitting with since November. Genevieve's letter had said, "He did not know. I chose not to tell him. I have no way of knowing now whether that was cowardice or love. Probably both." Which meant the man she was going to walk up to in a civic gallery in 2 days had 34 years of not knowing built into the architecture of his understanding of his own life. And she was going to ask him to restructure that architecture in a single conversation in a public room. She thought about her mother's handwriting, the urgency of it, the word afraid appearing 4 times in 3 pages. And then the decision, not impulsive, she could see that in the structure of the letter, in the deliberate specificity of the instructions, to tell her daughter anyway. To leave the letters. To leave the tin. To leave, at the bottom of a cedar chest under a shawl in a portrait miniature, the specific, explosive fact of who Evelyn actually was. Genevieve had been afraid her entire life. She had still done this. Evelyn lay in the dark of the Aldwell on the night of the 10th and thought about that, and about the 17-day carriage ride that had brought her here, and about Cedric in his formal study with his folder and his timeline, and she fell asleep with the specific completeness of someone who has made their decision and no longer needs to debate it. The morning of the 12th arrived with the particular clarity of a cold city day. Sharp light, no cloud, the kind of air that makes sounds carry further than expected. She was dressed and ready by 8, which was 3 hours before the exhibition opened, which gave her time to walk the civic quarter once, the way she always walked unfamiliar terrain before she needed to move through it with purpose. Cataloging the distances and the street lines and the location of the gallery entrance relative to the carriage drop. The Alderton Civic Gallery occupied a corner position on the western side of the promenade. It had 3 main rooms on the ground floor and 2 above, and the exhibition, a collection of southern landscape paintings and sculptural works sponsored by the various patronizing houses, was arranged across all 5. The founding patron reception, which was the portion of the afternoon to which Vallemont would be admitted and which Evelyn needed to be present for, was scheduled for the second-floor east room between the hours of 2 and 4. She had 2 hours to get into that room. She arrived at 1:30. The ground floor was already occupied with the general patron attendants, nobles of varying degrees of proximity to the houses in question, some with genuine interest in the art, most conducting the low-stakes social maintenance that events like this existed to facilitate. She moved through it with the ease of someone who has spent 14 years managing rooms, greeting the people she knew, avoiding the people she didn't want to be in a conversation with, maintaining the surface performance of a duchess attending a charity event on a winter afternoon. Lady Wyndham was there. They greeted each other with the careful warmth of women who had shared an uncomfortable evening and had tacitly agreed never to discuss it. Lord Pembroke was not present. A handful of minor nobles she recognized from the Ravenshade social calendar moved through the room with the grazing attention of people who are primarily there to be seen to be there. At 2:15, she moved to the stairs. The second-floor east room was smaller than the ground level, more intimate, and the works displayed there were the higher-value pieces. The cornerstone of the exhibition, the reason the founding patrons had been invited to this specific room at this specific time. There were perhaps 30 people present when she entered, a number that would grow slightly over the following hour and then thin again as the afternoon reached its natural conclusion. She took a position near the northeast corner, beside a large landscape in deep blues and grays, and she looked at it with the focused attention of a woman with genuine interest in painting, which she had, and she felt the room the way she felt all rooms, the currents of it, the clusters of conversation, the differential weight of various presences. She found him within 30 seconds. Lucien Vallemont was not a large man physically. She had expected large for no reason she could have articulated. Something about the weight of the reputation, she supposed, the way extreme authority tends to get translated in the imagination into physical scale. He was of average height, lean in the way of men who have not stopped moving in their 6th decade, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of face that had been strong and angular in youth and had retained the structure, if not the softness. He was standing near the central display case speaking with two men she did not recognize, and he had the quality she had heard described and had not quite believed until she saw it, the quality of complete presence. Not charisma exactly, something quieter and more thoroughgoing. He looked at the person he was speaking to the way very few people looked at other people, which was with the full allocation of attention, nothing held back for the room around them. She watched him for the length of time it took her to understand that she was, for the first time in this entire endeavor, genuinely afraid. Not of him specifically, not of what he might do. Afraid in the way you are afraid standing at the edge of something irreversible, not because the fall is certain, but because the jump is. She was going to walk across that room and say something that could not be unsaid. Whatever came after, acceptance, dismissal, anger, silence, she was going to have said it, and the world was going to be the kind of world in which that thing had been said, and there was no version of her life after this afternoon that looked like the version before it. She reached into her coat pocket and felt the folded oilcloth. She crossed the room. He did not notice her approach until she was at the edge of the conversational group, at which point one of the two men he was speaking with noticed her and shifted slightly in the unconscious way people shift to acknowledge a new presence, which caused Vallemont to turn. He looked at her with the full allocation attention she had observed from across the room. Up close, it was more arresting. Not warm exactly. Not cold either. Simply completely present. "My lord," she said, "forgive the intrusion. I wonder if I might speak with you privately for a few minutes." The two men looked at each other with the micro-expressions of people deciding whether to be offended or amused. Vallemont looked at her for a beat that was slightly longer than standard social duration, the beat of a man who is reading something and taking the time to read it accurately. "Do I know you?" he said. Not a dismissal, a genuine question. "No," she said. "You knew my mother." Something happened in his face, very small, the kind of adjustment that a person with full control over their expressions makes when something has moved faster than the control can follow. It lasted approximately 1 second, and then the control was back and his face was even and assessing. He said something brief to the two men. They excused themselves with the efficiency of people who recognize when they are being asked to leave without being asked to leave. Then he turned back to her. "Walk with me," he said. They moved to a quieter section of the room near the east window that looked out over the civic promenade. She stood with her back to the room and he stood facing her, which put the room behind him and her face in the window light. She noticed that. She did not think it was accidental. "Your mother," he said. His voice was low and entirely controlled. "Who was your mother?" "Genevieve Ashcombe," she said. The silence that followed had a different quality than any silence she had sat with in the past 4 months. This was not the silence of a man performing patience or a man preparing a response. This was the silence of a man for whom the room had just reorganized itself around a piece of information he had not been ready for and was now processing with the full available capacity of a mind. She was beginning to understand was genuinely formidable. "Genevieve," he said. The word was flat, not emotionless. The flatness was the product of a large emotion being very carefully managed. "She died 15 years ago," Eveline said. "I am her daughter. I am 34 years old." She held his gaze. "My name is Eveline. I was raised as the daughter of Lord Ashcombe. I believe that was the truth for 34 years. His eyes. She watched his eyes. Something moved through them that she did not have a precise name for. It was not the expression of a man being told something he already knew. It was not the expression of a man being deceived, which she had become extremely good at reading over the course of her marriage. It was the expression of a man receiving information that retroactively restructures a significant section of his past, and who is, in the immediate moment, simply absorbing the structural change without yet knowing what it means. "You're saying," he said very carefully, "that Genevieve—" "I have her letters," Eveline said. "And yours." The silence this time was absolute. She reached into her coat pocket and removed the oilcloth packet and held it in both hands without opening it. 22 letters. The dates. The locations. The specific, unguarded language of a correspondence that had lasted 4 years and had been preserved in a blue tin behind a panel in a window seat in a house in the Eastern Territories for 3 decades. He looked at the packet, then at her face. "You have my letters," he said. "She kept them," Eveline said. "She could not burn them. She said so." His jaw moved once. He looked at the window beside them, at the cold civic promenade below, with the expression of a man looking at a thing he has not seen, because what he has actually seen is something 34 years removed. She watched his profile and thought about the letters. "I have run out of interest in practical reasons." The man who had written that was in there somewhere behind the 61 years of governance and control and the particular armor of a person who has held significant power for a long time. "Why now?" he said. He turned back to her. "Why come to me now?" "Because I have nowhere else to go," she said, and then because she had decided in the carriage that the careful version of all the way was still all the way, and because I think you deserve to know. He looked at her for a long time. "The packet," he said. "May I?" She handed it to him. He unfolded the oilcloth with a care that was not the care of a man checking evidence. It was the care of a person handling something that has a different kind of weight than physical weight. He looked at the top letter. She had placed them in chronological order, the first one on top, the one that began, "My darling." And she watched his face and saw something there that she had not expected, something she had not prepared for, and had to look away from because it was too specific and too private to witness directly. He stood at the east window of the Alderton Civic Gallery and held the first letter and did not read it. Not completely, just looked at the handwriting, and she understood from the quality of his stillness that this was a handwriting he recognized, that it had moved in him the way things move when you recognize something you thought was gone. "There are 22, she said quietly. He folded the first letter back. He held the packet in both hands, looking down at it, and when he looked up, his face had made some adjustment she couldn't fully read. Not closed exactly, but more structured, as though he had made a decision about how to proceed. "I need to have these verified," he said. "The dates, the locations. I will need—" "I know," she said. "I expected that. This is not—" He stopped, started again. "If what you're telling me is true, it is true. If it is true," he continued, and the word "if" was not disbelief, she could hear that. It was the mechanical caution of a man who governed a territory and understood what happened when claims were advanced without adequate verification. "Then the implications are significant. You understand that." "I have spent 4 months understanding that," she said. He looked at her properly then, with the full allocation attention she had first observed from across the room, and she let him look because she had nothing to hide in her face at this moment. She had spent 14 years hiding things in her face. She was tired of it. She stood at the east window of the Alderton Civic Gallery and looked back at the most feared man in the Southern Territories and let him read whatever was there. "You are in trouble," he said, not a question. "My husband is pursuing dissolution," she said. "He has a 4-month timeline. He has resources and political support and a legal consultant. I have a 10 and 17 days and 1 introduction." She paused. "Now I have the introduction." The corner of his mouth moved. It was not a smile. It was the movement of a man who has appreciated a specific quality in something and is not going to perform a larger reaction than he actually feels. "Your husband," he said. "Duke Cedric Ravenshade." Ravenshade. He said the name the way you say the name of something you have a specific file on. "I know the name. Eastern Territories, minor house, significant local influence. He married an Ashcombe girl." He stopped, looked at her. "He married you." 14 years ago, she said, "and now he is dissolving the marriage in favor of a maid he has installed in my household." Yes, something moved in Valamont's face that was cold and specific and not, she thought, entirely about her. It was the expression of a man who has very particular views about how power is used and who has just received information about its misuse. "Give me 2 days," he said, "to have the letters verified, to make some inquiries." He looked at the packet in his hands. "Where are you staying?" She told him. "I will send a man," he said. "Tomorrow evening. He will carry my response." He paused. "Do not contact me directly in the interim. If Ravenshade has someone watching—" "He does," she said. "Or he will. He knows I'm in the capital. He will have someone watching by tomorrow morning at the latest." Valamont nodded once. "Then be careful." And he stopped and she saw it again. That fractional loss of control. The thing in his face that was not the Grand Duke of the Southern Territories, but was the man who had written "My Darling" in a heavy pressure hand and had not known, for 34 years, that it had consequences that were still walking around in the world. "If this is true." "It is true," she said. "If it is true," he said again, and the repetition was not stubbornness but the specific care of a man saying something that he knows will cost him something to mean, "then you are not alone." She stood at the east window and received those words and held them against the part of her chest where the cracked wall had been. And she did not cry, because she had made a decision about crying some months ago, and the decision held, but it was close. It was closer than she expected. "Thank you," she said. He inclined his head with a formality that was covering something she was not going to press, and turned to move back into the room. She stayed at the window. Below on the promenade, the February cold had driven most of the foot traffic inside, and the stone of the civic quarter sat in the thin afternoon light with the particular patience of old things that have seen many versions of the same story. She watched the empty promenade and felt, underneath the fear and the adrenaline and the structural uncertainty of everything that came next, something she had not felt in so long she had to think twice before she could name it. Not safety. Too early for safety. Something more specific and more durable than safety. The feeling of being seen with accurate eyes. The feeling of a fact being received as a fact, without negotiation or dismissal, by someone with the capacity to do something with it. The packet was in his hands now, moving with him across the room. 22 letters, 34 years old, written by a man who had not known he was creating evidence, and a woman who could not bring herself to destroy it. All the small, irrational acts of preservation that people perform when they are keeping something alive against their better judgment. The tin, the panel, the cedar chest. The letter that said, "Look for this, find it, do not let it stay buried." Her mother had been afraid her entire life. She had still done this. Evelyn turned from the window and moved back into the room. She spent another 40 minutes at the exhibition because leaving immediately after that exchange would look exactly like what it was. And she was not ready to be what it looked like yet. She looked at paintings. She spoke to 2 people. She drank half a glass of wine and replaced it on a passing tray and checked the room twice for faces she did not recognize, who were looking at her with the specific quality of attention that meant they were there for her rather than for the exhibition. She counted 3. 1 near the door, young, unhurried, the careful studied ease of someone trying to look like a patron and not quite landing it. 1 at the base of the stairs, one she had clocked on the ground floor on her way in, and who had, she noted now, appeared on the 2nd floor without attending any of the art between the ground level and the east room. Cedric had moved faster than she expected. Not surprising, on reflection. He knew she was in the capital. He had the resources. The question was not whether he was watching, but what the watchers were authorized to do, observe and report, or something with more active instructions. She did not know the answer to that, and the not knowing was a specific quality of pressure in the back of her skull. She left the exhibition at 3:40. Standard departure time for the afternoon session, unremarkable. She walked back toward the Aldwell through the civic quarter with the unhurried pace of a woman returning from a social event, And she did not check behind her because checking behind you told watchers they had been made, and she needed them to believe she had not made them yet. She counted footsteps behind her for 3 blocks. There were 2 sets that did not belong to the general foot traffic. They maintained the right distance, professional distance, the distance of people who knew what they were doing. She thought about Thomas for a moment and then put the thought away because it was not useful. She entered the Aldwell and went directly upstairs. In her room, she locked the door, sat on the edge of the bed, and did the accounting. Valemont had the letters. He had said 2 days, which meant the 12th and the 13th were the waiting period, and she would have a response by the evening of the 13th. She had booked the rooms through the 14th. Cedric had given her 3 days, which meant he expected her on the 15th at the latest, and if she was not back by the 15th, the absence would be in the legal record currently being constructed, documented as exactly the kind of irregular behavior that dissolution proceedings loved. She had approximately 48 hours. In 48 hours, she would know whether Lucien Valemont believed her, whether he intended to do anything about it, whether 22 letters and the specific quality of a dead woman's handwriting that he recognized were enough to move a man who had not had to be moved by anything external in 30 years. She lay back on the bed in her traveling clothes and stared at the ceiling. She thought about the look on his face when he held the first letter, the fractional loss of control, the thing underneath the Grand Duke that was something older and less armored. She had not manufactured that. She had not been close enough to predict it. It had been real, which meant something underneath the 61 years of power and governance was responding to something it recognized. And recognition was not nothing. Recognition was, in fact, the single most useful thing she could have hoped for from a first meeting. She thought about him saying, "You are not alone." She thought about how much weight 4 words could carry when they arrived in the right order at the right moment in a life that had been structurally organized around the opposite conclusion. She closed her eyes. She slept. She woke at 6 in the evening to the sound of a knock on the door that was 2 short and 1 long, the pattern she had given to the Aldwell's front desk for priority messages. Not Valemont's man. Too early for that. She opened the door. The Aldwell's desk boy handed her a sealed letter with the expression of someone who has been tipped significantly to deliver something quickly and not remember doing it. She took it. The seal was Ravenshade Crest. She closed the door and opened it. The letter was not from Cedric. It was from his solicitor. Formal language, precise structure, the kind of document that has been prepared by someone who knows it will become part of a legal record. It informed her, and the word informed was doing elaborate legal work in the context of the sentence it appeared in, that Duke Ravenshade had filed a preliminary petition for dissolution with the Imperial Family Court as of the morning of the 12th of February, that the petition cited grounds of abandonment and conduct unbecoming of the ducal household, and that her presence was formally requested at a hearing currently scheduled for the 22nd of February. 10 days. She read the letter twice. Then she set it on the writing table and looked at it with the specific focused attention she gave to problems that needed to be solved in a short window with limited resources. He had filed the petition. Today. While she was standing at an east window in a civic gallery, passing 22 letters to a man who did not yet know if he believed her. He had filed it on the same day, which meant either the filing was scheduled regardless of her movements, and today was coincidence, or he had someone inside her itinerary and had moved in response to the exhibition visit. She thought about the 3 faces she had clocked in the gallery. She thought about conduct unbecoming of the ducal household. 10 days. Valemont needed 2 days for verification. That left 8 days before the hearing, 8 days to either have something standing behind her or be standing alone in front of an Imperial Family Court judge with a solicitor across from her, and nothing but her own account, and a dead woman's letters against the full institutional weight of a duke who had spent months building a case. She stood up. She went to the window. Below the civic promenade was dark now, the afternoon light entirely gone, the cold pressing down on the city with the flat authority of a February night. She thought about a woman who had been afraid her entire life and had still done the specific, extraordinary, dangerous thing of leaving behind the one piece of information that changed everything. She thought about a man standing at an east window holding a letter in a handwriting he recognized, and the thing that had moved through his face that she had not been able to look at directly. She thought about 10 days. Then she picked up the letter and folded it into her coat pocket and sat down at the writing table and waited for the morning of the 13th with the stillness of someone who has passed the point where stillness is a choice. It was simply what remained. The carriage had left the gate. The words had been said. The letters were in his hands. The petition was filed. There was no version of her life now that went back to the East Cottage and the quiet disappearance and the careful erasure of a woman who had finally, at the age of 34, understood who she was. She sat at the writing table in the Aldwell on the night of the 12th of February and waited. And outside the window, the capital lay in the February dark. And somewhere in the city, Lucien Vallemont was sitting with 22 letters. And somewhere in the Eastern Territories, Cedric Ravenshade was reading a solicitor's confirmation that the petition had been filed, and the machine that would determine the rest of her life was in motion. And there was not one thing left in the world she could do except be exactly who she had decided to be when she stepped out of Ravenshade Manor and did not look back. The knock came at 9:17 the following evening. 2 short, 1 long. She was at the writing table. She had been at the writing table for most of the day, with the accounts and the notebook and the timeline laid out in front of her in the careful arrangement of a woman who processes crisis by making its components visible and countable. She had eaten once. She had not left the room. She opened the door. The man in the corridor was middle-aged, unremarkable in every deliberate way, the kind of person you would not look at twice in a public space and were not supposed to. He handed her a sealed packet, heavier than a single letter, the seal clean and red and marked with the Vallemont crest, and was gone before she had fully closed the door. She sat at the writing table. She looked at the seal for a moment with the specific awareness of a person about to open something that is either the answer or the end of the answer. The seal broke clean. Inside, a single sheet of paper in the large controlled handwriting she recognized from the letters in the tin. Not many words. The language was precise and undecorated, which she was beginning to understand was his natural register when he was not performing anything. She read it once. Then she read it again, more slowly, to make sure the meaning she had received on the first reading was the actual meaning and not the meaning she had wanted. It was the actual meaning. She set the letter down on the writing table. Outside the window, the capital sat in the February night and was entirely indifferent to the fact that in a room in the Aldwell, a woman who had spent 34 years being told she had nowhere to go had just received, in the large controlled handwriting of the most feared man in the Southern Territories, 4 sentences that changed the structure of everything. 4 sentences. The first confirmed the letters. The second stated an intention. The third named a date. The fourth was 3 words, which were not the 3 words you would expect from a man of his reputation and his power and his 61 years of governing a territory without softness, but which were, she thought, the most accurate 3 words available for the specific situation, and which she read a third time and then pressed her palm flat over, as though the words needed to be kept warm. I will be there. She did not know in that moment what the 22nd of February was going to look like. She did not know what an imperial family court hearing became when a Grand Duke arrived as a party in interest. She did not know what Cedric's face would do when those doors opened. She did not know what was going to be said or decided or recorded in the court's formal documents as the legal truth of who she was. What she knew, pressing her palm over those 3 words in the cold Aldwell room on the night of the 13th of February, was that she was not walking into that room alone. For the first time in 34 years, she was not alone. Thursday, 9 days. 9 days until the Imperial Family Court convened and Cedric Ravenshade stood in a wood-paneled room before a judge with his solicitor and his evidence, and the complete confidence of a man who had surveyed all the exits and found them sealed. And Evelyn Ashcombe, Evelyn Vallemont, sat in a room in the capital with a letter that contained a date and an intention and 3 words that had restructured every calculation she had been running since November. She had not won anything yet. The hearing was 9 days away. The terrain between here and there was dense with the kind of institutional opposition that a duke could generate when he had the resources and the motivation and the legal infrastructure already in motion. But she had stopped being the woman in the West Wing. She had stopped being the woman who knelt. And on the 22nd of February, in the wood-paneled room of the Imperial Family Court, the man who had built a 4-month case against a woman he believed had nowhere to go was going to look at the door when it opened, and understand, in the specific, irreversible way of a man watching his certainty collapse from the inside, that he had been wrong about the exits. The 22nd of February arrived without ceremony. No particular quality of light, no change in the temperature of the city. The capital went about its morning business with the complete indifference of a place that does not know or care that on this specific day, in the wood-paneled chambers of the imperial family court on the north side of the civic quarter, a woman was going to walk through a door and either emerge as someone new or not emerge at all. Evelyn was dressed by 7. She had chosen the gray. Not the burgundy of the banquet night. That dress belonged to a woman who had dressed for a battle she did not yet know the shape of, who had walked into a room to be diminished and had chosen color as a last act of defiance. This was different. The gray was clean and severe and made no argument except the argument of a person who knows exactly who they are and does not need the room to confirm it. She wore no jewelry except the small silver pin that had belonged to her mother, not the raven-shade jewels, none of which she had touched since November, none of which she intended to touch again. She looked at herself in the Aldwell mirror for a long moment. 34 years old, the face she had always had, the eyes her mother had called intelligent and her husband had never described, the face of a woman who had spent 9 days in a capital hotel room rebuilding from the specific wreckage of everything she had believed about her own powerlessness, something that did not yet have a full name, but felt, in the bones of it, like the beginning of an actual life. She picked up the coat. The oilcloth packet was in the inner pocket. She had kept it there as a physical fact. The weight of it against her ribs as she moved through the city, a constant low reminder of what she was carrying and why. Thomas met her in the lobby. Not Thomas Greer, a different Thomas. The man Valamont had sent as her formal escort for the day, a senior member of the Valamont household staff, whose age and bearing communicated the institutional weight behind his presence without requiring any words. He greeted her with the precise formality of someone representing a house that understood what formality communicated in a court setting. She accepted the greeting with equal precision, and they walked out into the February morning together. The carriage waiting outside bore the Valamont crest on its door. She looked at it for one beat. The silver house device on the lacquered black panel, the specific weight of what it meant to arrive somewhere in a carriage that announced your patronage before you had said a single word. And then she got in. The Imperial Family Court building was 12 minutes from the Aldwell. She spent 11 of those minutes looking out the window at the city and one of them pressing her palm flat against the inner pocket of her coat. She was not afraid. That was the thing she checked and kept finding true. She had been afraid on the 13th, waiting for Valamont's letter. She had been afraid in the gallery, crossing the room. She had been afraid every day of the 9 days between the 13th and now, in the specific way of someone who is moving towards something enormous and cannot yet see its full dimensions. But this morning, the fear had resolved into something else, something quieter and more load-bearing, a foundational quality that was not the absence of danger but the acceptance of it. She had made her choices. She had come to the end of the road where choices were available. What came next was simply what came next. The carriage stopped. She got out. The Imperial Family Court building was older than most of the civic quarter around it. Stone in the way of things that were built before anyone worried about how they looked and had ended up, incidentally, beautiful because of it. Wide steps. 2 guards at the main entrance. A set of inner doors that opened into a vaulted anteroom where the sound of footsteps multiplied and the temperature dropped by several degrees. She saw Cedric's solicitor first. He was standing near the far wall of the anteroom with 2 assistants, reviewing documents with the practiced calm of a man who has done this particular kind of work many times and has long since stopped feeling the human texture of it. He saw her and performed a brief reassessment, the carriage outside, her escort, the gray dress, the specific quality of her posture, and something moved in his face that was not quite surprise but was the professional cousin of it. She nodded at him. He did not nod back. She was shown to the waiting room adjacent to the main chamber. The court officer who showed her in was a young man with the blank efficiency of someone concentrating on his function, and he told her the hearing would begin at 9 and left her in a room with 3 chairs and a window that looked out onto the building's inner courtyard. At 8:47, the door opened. Lucien Valamont walked in. She had seen him once, in the gallery, across a room, and then up close for 10 minutes. She had read his letters. She had constructed, from those materials, a detailed but necessarily incomplete picture of him. The man who walked into the waiting room was the picture and also more than the picture, the way people always exceed the account you have made of them from a distance. He was in full formal dress, the dark coat with the Valamont house colors at the collar, the silver crest pin that matched hers in material, if not in design. He looked like what he was, a man who had governed something significant for a long time and carried that governance in the way he occupied space. He looked at her and she looked at him, and for a moment neither of them spoke, which was appropriate because neither of them had, she thought, the precisely right words for this particular moment, and the silence was not uncomfortable. "The letter's verified," he said. "I know. You told me. I needed to say it again. In this building." He crossed to the window and looked out at the courtyard. "I have been trying to think since the 13th about what Genevieve would have wanted from this." He paused. "I don't know the answer to that. I think she wanted me to be safe," Evelyn said. "I think she wanted me to have the option she couldn't give me while she was alive." She looked at his profile against the window light. "I think she also wanted you to know. She said so, in the letter." He was quiet. "I read her letter," she said. "The one in the cedar chest. She said she was afraid and she still wanted you to know. Not for political reasons. She said she was afraid you would—" She stopped, started again. "She said she was afraid you would grieve for it. For the time." His jaw moved once. He kept looking at the courtyard. "I have been grieving for it since the 13th, he said. "That is its own kind of answer." She sat with that for a moment. "I don't need you to grieve," she said. "I don't need you to feel responsible for what was chosen before I existed. I came to you because I needed—" She stopped, finding the accurate word. "Because I needed someone with standing. Someone who could make what I am into something the court could not simply discard. I understand what you came for," he said. He turned from the window. "I also want you to understand what I am here for." He looked at her with the direct assessing attention she had first seen in the gallery. "I am not here as a political patron. I am here because you are my daughter. Whatever the court decides today about the dissolution and the name and the inheritance, those are legal questions, and they will have legal answers. But that is what I am here as." He paused. "I needed you to hear me say that before we walked into the chamber." The room was very quiet. She thought about the word daughter, not the legal category of it, the actual word, in his actual voice, in this specific room, 9 days after a gallery visit that had taken her 4 months to engineer and 14 years to need. She thought about what it weighed. She thought about the fact that she was 34 years old and was hearing this word applied to herself by a man who meant it for the first time in her life. Because Lord Ashcombe had been kind and had loved her genuinely, and had also, she understood now with the particular clarity of things seen at a necessary distance, never once made her feel like someone who had come from him, someone whose existence was continuous with his own. She did not cry. She had made her decision about crying, and the decision held. "Thank you," she said, which was insufficient, which was also all she had. The court officer knocked and opened the door at 8:59. The main chamber of the imperial family court was exactly what the anteroom had prepared her for. Old stone and dark wood, and the weight of institutional authority laid into every surface. The judicial bench ran the full width of the room at the far end. 3 judges in the formal gray of the court. A gallery to the right for the witnesses and interested parties that courts permitted in proceedings of this type. A clerk's table. 2 advocate positions facing the bench. Cedric was already at the left advocate position. She had not seen him since the day she left Ravenshade with the smaller carriage and the tin under her coat, and did not look back. She processed this in the first second of entering the room, cataloging automatically. He looked like himself. The sharp jaw, the precise dress, the posture that expected the room to accept him. He was standing with his solicitor and 2 assistants, and the expression of a man in complete command of the situation he had spent 4 months building. He saw her. His eyes went to the escort behind her first, which was instinctive. You read power by reading the people around it. And she saw the calculation moving in his face as he identified the Valamont household livery and understood what it meant. Then he looked at her, directly, and she watched his certainty, not collapsing, not yet, but beginning to do something she recognized from structural analysis of other things, beginning to develop questions it had not previously thought to ask. She held his gaze for 1 beat, then she moved to the right advocate position. Valamont took a seat in the gallery with the specific, unhurried authority of a man who has chosen his position and does not need to announce it. The chief judge called the proceedings to order. What followed was, on its surface, the ordinary machinery of institutional process. The formal reading of the petition, the statement of grounds, the solicitor's careful enumeration of what the dissolution sought and on what basis. Cedric's legal preparation was, she noted with the dispassionate acknowledgement she had developed for things she could not control, thorough. The abandonment grounds were thin, but technically arguable given the capital trip. The conduct grounds were more substantial. The solicitor had assembled a file of documented irregularities in the management of the household accounts, the unauthorized trip to the Ashcombe property, the correspondence with Valamont's household. She listened to all of it without expression. Her advocate, a woman named Marin Holst, whom Valamont had arranged and who was the kind of legal professional you recognized immediately as formidable because she listened to her opposition with the focused attention of someone identifying exactly which threads she was going to pull, let the solicitor finish. Then she stood. "The petition is based on a foundational premise," Marin Holst said. "That is incorrect." She did not look at the solicitor. She looked at the bench. "The petition concerns the dissolution of a marriage entered into between Duke Cedric Ravenshade and Evelyn Ashcombe, representing the Ashcombe House. It proceeds on the assumption that the Ashcombe House represents the full legal identity of the petitioned party." A brief pause. "It does not." The chief judge looked up. "Explain." Marin Holst presented the case the way a person builds a structure. Foundation first, then the walls in sequence. Nothing placed before its support was in position. The letters. The verification, conducted by 2 independent archivists retained by the Valamont household, whose written conclusions were entered into the court record. The dating. The corroborating documentary evidence from the Southern Port City registries confirming the Winter Trade Summit 35 years ago, and the documented presence of both Genevieve Ashcombe and Grand Duke Lucien Valamont. The biological claim and the legal framework under imperial law governing the recognition of blood lineage when documentary evidence met the court's evidentiary standard. Cedric's solicitor objected 3 times. The bench sustained none of them. When Marin Holst finished, the chamber had the quality of a room that has been rearranged while the occupants were watching something else. The clerk was writing. The judges were conferring in the low, rapid register of people processing something more complex than the proceeding they had prepared for. The gallery was still in the way of people who are trying very hard not to look at each other. Cedric was looking at her. She looked back. She had thought about this moment. She had thought about what she would feel, seeing his face when he understood what she had. The satisfaction she had expected was not present in the form she had expected it. What she felt instead was quieter and more complicated. Not forgiveness, not yet, not in this room, but something adjacent to it. The recognition that the man across the chamber was not simply the instrument of her suffering, but also a person who had arrived at this moment by a series of choices that had, in the making of each individual choice, seemed to him probably reasonable. That did not excuse any of it. But it was a truer account of him than the simple villain he had been in her worst nights, and she had decided some weeks ago that she was not interested in simple accounts of complicated things. The chief judge called for a recess. In the anteroom during the recess, Cedric's solicitor approached Marin Holst with the expression of a man who has read the terrain and is looking for an exit that preserves maximum dignity. Evelyn stood near the courtyard window and did not participate in that conversation. She looked at the courtyard, stone, bare winter garden, a single tree that had lost its leaves and was simply itself, without decoration. She thought about what Valamont had said. "I have been grieving for it since the 13th. She thought about her mother pressing her face between her palms in the last afternoon they were together, with the expression of a woman storing something she knew she was about to lose. She thought about all the ways fear makes people choose silence when they know something that would change everything, and all the ways those silences compound across time until the thing that was hidden has grown so large that the hiding itself becomes a kind of landscape. Valamont came to stand beside her. They stood at the courtyard window together. He was quiet for a moment. "How are you?" he said. It was such an ordinary question. She had not been asked it, and she tried to calculate and found she genuinely could not remember the last time someone had asked it with the actual intention of receiving an honest answer. "I'm not sure yet," she said. "Ask me again in a month." The corner of his mouth moved. The expression she had seen once in the gallery, not a full smile, but the movement of a man who has appreciated something specifically. "A month," he said. "Yes, that seems right." The hearing resumed at 11:15. The resolution came in the form, The machinery of law produces when the evidence is sufficient and the institutional will to oppose it is not, procedurally, incrementally, without drama. The blood claim was entered into the court record. The recognition of lineage under imperial law required a formal process that would take several weeks, but the court entered a preliminary finding that the claim had sufficient evidentiary weight to proceed. The dissolution petition was not dismissed outright. The law did not allow for that on these grounds alone. But it was tabled pending the resolution of the lineage question, which changed its entire political and legal context, which Cedric's solicitor understood perfectly, and which was why he had been negotiating in the anteroom during the recess. Cedric was asked by the chief judge if he wished to speak. He stood. She had not heard him speak since the night in the main study, the settlement conversation, the voice of a man whose certainty was still intact. The voice she heard now was different in a way that was difficult to name precisely. Not broken, not humbled in the performed way of a man executing a strategic retreat. Different in a way that was, she thought, more honest than most things he had said to her in 14 years. "I want to withdraw the petition," he said. The chief judge looked at him. "The grounds for withdrawal. I don't think—" Cedric stopped. He looked at the floor for a moment, which was something she had never seen him do, and when he looked up again he looked at the bench rather than at her, which was either deliberate avoidance or the specific difficulty of looking at a person you have damaged significantly and cannot repair. "I don't think the petition represents the full truth of the situation. I think it should be withdrawn." The solicitor beside him showed nothing on his face, which was its own kind of eloquence. The petition was withdrawn at 11:42. She sat with that for a moment. The thing she had spent 4 months working toward, the reversal she had been building toward through the tin and the letters and the gallery and the 9 days of waiting, had arrived in the form of a procedural withdrawal in a wood-paneled room and a sentence from a man who had said, in the specific legal language available to him, that the case he had built against her was not the truth. It was not enough. It was also more than she had expected, and she was honest enough with herself to hold both of those things at the same time. She walked out of the Imperial Family Court building at noon. The February sun was low and white, the kind of winter sun that gives light without warmth, and it hit the stone of the civic quarter steps in a way that made the city look clean. She stood at the top of the steps and looked at the promenade and breathed the cold air and felt the specific quality of a moment that does not know yet what it is, that is still in the interval between what was and what comes next, that exists in the brief suspended present of things that have ended before the new thing has fully arrived. Valamont stood beside her. "There will be a formal recognition process," he said. "Several weeks, as I said. It requires documentation presented to the Imperial Registry and a formal court session with the appropriate witnesses." He looked at the promenade. "My solicitors will handle the mechanics. You will need to be present for 2 sessions." "All right," she said. "You are welcome to stay in the capital during the process. I have a townhouse on the East Quarter. There is a set of rooms that have been empty for several years." He said it in the tone of a man making an administrative arrangement rather than an offer, which was, she understood, how he managed the emotional weight of things that were too large for him to approach directly. It was not so different from how she managed things. She recognized the mechanism. It would be more practical than a hotel for the duration. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." He nodded once. He looked at her for a moment with the full allocation attention that she was beginning to understand was simply how he looked at things he cared about. "She made a difficult choice," he said. "Your mother." "Yes. I have been—" He stopped. "I don't think I have the right to be angry about it. She had her reasons. They were her reasons to have." He looked at the promenade. "But I would like, sometime when you are ready, to hear about her, about what she was like, after." It was the most personal thing he had said to her, and it cost him something to say it. She could see that in the slight adjustment of his posture, the particular quality of the stillness around the sentence. A man 61 years old asking a question that put something real on display. She was afraid a lot of the time, Evelyn said. But she was also very specific about what she loved. She loved the East Parlor in autumn. She loved a particular kind of pie that nobody else seemed to find interesting. She argued with her housekeeper about the flower arrangements in a way that always ended with the housekeeper winning, and she seemed to consider that an acceptable outcome. She paused. She pressed my face in her hands the last time I saw her. She didn't say anything. I've been trying to understand that for 15 years. Valamont was quiet for a moment. I think, he said carefully, she was trying to memorize it. She looked at him. I think she was storing it, he said, the way you store something you love before you have to let it go. The February sun was low on the civic quarter stones. She stood at the top of the court steps and felt something move through her chest. Not the crack, not the weight, not the thing she had been pressing against from the inside for 4 months. Something older and softer and more foundational, the kind of feeling that lives below the strategic and the tactical and the survival level processing, the kind that only surfaces when the emergency is over and the body finally understands it is safe. She did not cry. She had made her decision. She held her mother's face in her mind, that last afternoon, those hands, that expression she had spent 15 years decoding. She was storing it. Yes, that was right. That was the most accurate account of a woman who had been afraid her entire life and had still found, in the specific difficult architecture of her choices, the ways to leave behind the things she loved most. The letters in the tin, the panel in the window seat, the cedar chest, the handwriting that said, "Look for this, find it, do not let it stay buried." All of it storage, all of it love in the particular form available to someone operating under fear, not expressed directly, but preserved, left intact, trusted to time and the judgment of a daughter she had shaped without fully knowing it, and to exactly the person capable of retrieving it. She exhaled. The sound of the city came back around her about, the carriage traffic on the promenade, the sound of voices from the buildings along the civic quarter, the particular acoustic texture of a capital going about its afternoon business in February without knowing or caring about the specific shape of the day that had just passed. She thought about Ravenshade, not Cedric, not with the particular focused energy she had been giving him for months, the strategic thinking about him that was a form of being defined by him even in opposition. She thought about the manor itself, the 40-foot ceilings, the 3 chandeliers, the West Wing room, the cedar chest at the foot of the bed, the small second-floor study where she had sat by the window and pressed her palm against cold glass, and thought about what lived under snow. She was not going back. The decision arrived in the same form the morning's non-fear had arrived, not as a choice, but as a recognition of a thing already settled. The dissolution was withdrawn, which meant the legal status of the marriage was, technically, suspended rather than terminated, and there were processes to work through. But she was not going back into those rooms, and that was not a legal question. It was a simpler and more fundamental question. Where did she live now, in the body of a woman who had spent 34 years believing she had nowhere to go, and had discovered that the belief was built on a withheld fact? She lived somewhere else. The formal recognition would take several weeks. The East Quarter townhouse had empty rooms. The process had mechanics that Valamont's solicitors would handle and that she would need to be present for in 2 sessions. In the interval, she would learn the new territory, not gratefully, not with the performed emotion of a woman who has been rescued, but with the careful attention of someone who has arrived somewhere new and intends to understand it fully before deciding what to build there. There was work to do. Not revenge. She had thought about revenge in the early months and found it less interesting than she expected. Not performance. Actual work, the kind she was good at, understanding a situation's true structure, identifying what was missing in it, determining what would be needed to fill what was missing. She had spent 14 years managing a household that had tried to erase her from itself, and she had done it well despite everything. And there were women in the Eastern Territories living in the specific quiet erasure of marriages that had been built to diminish them, who did not have a cedar chest with a blue tin in it, who did not have a mother who kept letters, who did not have a name. They had not yet claimed waiting for them in the inventory of what they actually were. She would not save all of them. She was not that. But she was someone now who had standing, who had resources, who understood from the inside the exact dimensions of the trap because she had spent 14 years inside it. That knowledge was not nothing. It was in fact one of the most specific and useful kinds of knowledge available, and wasting it seemed like an offense against the specific cost at which it had been acquired. The weeks that followed had a different texture than anything before them. The formal recognition process moved through its machinery with the methodical efficiency of institutional processes that have been in motion long enough to find their own rhythm. She appeared at the 2 required sessions, presented the documentation with Marin Holst at her side, answered the questions of the court registry officials with the direct clarity of someone who is telling the truth and knows it. The archivist's verification reports were entered. The lineage claim was evaluated under the 3 criteria of imperial law governing such proceedings. The documentation met all 3. On the 14th of March, the Imperial Registry formally entered the recognition. Evelyn Valamont. The name in the official document was clean and spare and had the quality of a fact. Not a new fact, an old one, corrected. The oldest fact about her, the one that had been withheld for 34 years, finally in its proper place in the record. She sat with the document for a while. She thought about her mother choosing a name for a daughter she was about to raise in someone else's story. She thought about all the things Genevieve Ashcombe had known while saying ordinary things, while directing the flower arrangements, while losing arguments with the housekeeper, while pressing her daughter's face between her palms in the last light of an autumn afternoon. All the knowing contained in silence. All the love that had to take the form of things saved rather than things said. She forgave her, not as a decision exactly. Forgiveness rarely arrived as a decision for Evelyn. She was too honest about her own internal processes to mistake managed acceptance for actual release. It arrived as a gradual structural change, the way water works on stone, the way the accumulated evidence of intention and love and impossible constraint finally outweighs the evidence of damage. Her mother had been afraid and had still saved the letters, had still written the document, had still said, "Look for this." That was worth more than she knew how to quantify. And quantifying things, she had decided, was not what this particular accounting called for. She ran into Cedric once, not at the court, not at any formal proceeding, at the civic garden near the Aldwell, in late March, when the capital had begun doing its spring performance with the blossoms along the promenade. He was alone, walking in the way of someone who has nowhere specific to be, which was not a thing she had ever seen in him before. He looked like himself in the surface way, the jaw, the posture, the careful dress, but something in the underlying quality had shifted, not collapsed, not broken, but changed in the irreversible way of things that have been under sufficient structural pressure for sufficient time. He saw her. He stopped. She stopped. They were approximately 10 feet apart on a civic garden path in late March with the first spring blossoms overhead, and neither of them said anything for a moment that was long enough to be deliberate. "You're well," he said. "Not a question." "Yes," she said. He looked at her with an expression she did not have a precise name for, not the contempt of the main study, not the performed ease of the banquet night, something more unguarded and more costly. The expression of a person who has had several weeks to sit with the accounting of their own choices and has found the total larger than they expected. "The Ravenshade estate is—" He stopped. "There are decisions to be made about it. Structural decisions. I wanted you to know that." He paused. "I thought you should hear that from me rather than from the solicitors." She looked at him. She thought about this banquet night, the teapot in her hands, the steadiness of her hands, the 41 faces looking at a different direction. She thought about 7 years of careful arithmetic, the small dispossessions, the managed diminishments, the systematic removal of every authority and comfort that could be removed without crossing into anything the law would name. She thought about the west sitting room given to Lillian and the second-floor study and the locked library and Thomas's handwriting on the desk in the East Library. She thought about a woman who was 22 years old and had been given pearls that belonged to a dead woman's mother and had looked at Evelyn with the eyes of someone who did not yet know what kind of person she had bound her future to. "Where is Lillian?" she said. Something moved in his face. "She left, 2 weeks after the hearing." His voice was even, but the evenness was the kind that has been constructed over something that cost something. "She had family in the western counties. She went back." Evelyn looked at this path between them. She thought about a girl who had laughed with her throat and touched borrowed pearls and had believed herself safe. She hoped the girl in the western counties was all right. She hoped, with the specific low-heat warmth of a feeling that was not its own resolution, but was its own real thing, that whatever came next for Lillian was better than what had come before. "Make the structural decisions," Evelyn said, "whatever the estate requires. That is yours to do." He looked at her for a moment. "I know what I did," he said. The sentence was short and undecorated and had the quality of something that had been said internally many times before finally being said aloud. "I'm not asking you to—" He stopped. "I don't know what I'm asking." "I know," she said. The morning light was moving through the blossoms overhead. That particular spring in the capital light, that had the quality of water rather than fire, cool and diffuse and generous to everything it touched. She looked at the man who had spent 7 years learning the exact shape of her silence and using it as a key, and she felt, not warmth, not yet, perhaps not ever in the register she had once expected to feel for a husband, but something honest and specific. The particular feeling of seeing a person accurately, fully, without either the protective distance of hatred or the distorting proximity of need. He was a man who had made choices. The choices had cost him specific things. He was going to live with the accounting of those choices in the specific ongoing way that people live with the accounting of irreversible things. Not all at once, not dramatically, but every morning, in the ordinary available light. That was not her work to do. It was his. "Take care of yourself, Cedric," she said. She walked past him down the civic garden path, and she did not look back. And it was a different kind of not looking back than the one in front of Ravenshade Manor. That one had been necessary, functional, the not looking back of a woman who needed all her forward attention to survive what was ahead. This one was simply the natural direction of a person who has finished with a thing and is walking toward what comes next. The recognition document was in her coat pocket. The silver pin that had belonged to her mother was at her collar. The spring light was doing its generous, indifferent work on the city around her. She thought about the balcony of the Valamont townhouse on the East Quarter, which she had stood on twice in the past few weeks in the late afternoon, watching the capital settle into evening. The first time she had stood there, she had felt the strangeness of it. The new coordinates, the different light, the unfamiliar angles of an unfamiliar building becoming, slowly, a place she lived. The second time she had stood there, she had thought, this is what it feels like to be in the right place. Not comfort exactly. Not safety in the final, complete sense that people mean when they say they feel safe, but the absence of the particular cold that comes from being fundamentally, structurally alone in a world that has organized itself around your erasure. She walked out of the civic garden onto the promenade. The city moved around her. Carriages, voices, the sound of the capital in the first real days of spring. The particular acoustic texture of a place waking up from a long cold season and remembering what it was. She walked through it without hurry, in the gray dress that made no argument except the argument of a person who knows what they are, with the recognition a document in her pocket and the silver pin at her collar and the specific, foundational quality of a woman who has arrived somewhere after a very long journey and has not yet fully mapped the new territory, but is no longer afraid of what the map will show. She thought about what her mother's hands had felt like on her face. Warm. Specific. The pressure of a woman trying to store something she loved before the time ran out. She thought, I understand now. Not the understanding of resolution, not the clean closure of things that end in the right place and stay there. The understanding of a person who has received a thing late and imperfectly and at significant cost, and who has decided that late and imperfect and costly is still better than not at all, that the gaps in a story do not negate what the story was, that a woman who was afraid her whole life and still saved the letters was still a woman who loved, specifically and durably, and in the specific forms available to her. The Capitol Promenade ran along the civic quarter for 6 blocks before it curved south toward the older residential streets. She walked the full 6 blocks in the spring light, unhurried, taking the city in the way you take in a place you are beginning to know. At the end of the 6th block, she turned south. She was going home, not to the manor, not to the West Wing room or the small second-floor study or the cold marble of the entrance hall where she had stood at the foot of the stairs on the night of the banquet.